What's up, guys? Welcome to Wizardium. We've got something special today. What if Harry and Hermione remembered their past lives as ancient sorcerers? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The First Fracture. The defense against the dark arts classroom smelled like burned parchment and old fear, which Harry had always thought was appropriate. Professor Aldrich Crane knew this year, replacing the rotating disaster of previous instructors with something that at least resembled competence, had the students on their feet and practicing shield charms. The theory was simple enough. The execution for most of sixth years was proving humbling. Neville had already knocked over 2 chairs. Lavender Brown was producing shields that flickered like a candle in a draft. Ron was doing adequately, which for Ron in this particular subject meant he was probably fine. Harry wasn't paying attention, not in the checked-out staring-at-the-ceiling way. He was standing at his station with his wand raised in the correct position, going through the motions with the kind of automatic competence that came from 5 years of people genuinely trying to kill him. His shield snapped up clean and hard every time Crane sent a testing charm his way. The professor had stopped bothering to check on Harry about 10 minutes ago. The problem was the light coming through the window. It was the particular quality of late September light in Scotland, amber and slightly exhausted, slanting low through the ancient glass and falling in long parallelograms across the stone floor. Harry had been watching it without meaning to, and something about the angle or the dust moving in it, or the way the shadow of the window frame stretched exactly 45 degrees across the stone, he was somewhere else. Not dreaming, not the way Voldemort's visions worked, not that pulling through a drain sensation he'd learned to dread. This was more like remembering something that hadn't happened to him, except it had. He knew it had with a certainty that bypassed argument entirely, the way you know your own name. He was standing on a plateau. The stone under his feet was warm desert warmth, stored from a sun that had already set, radiating back up through leather-soled sandals. The sky was an extraordinary dark blue, the kind that exists for maybe 10 minutes at true dusk before it collapses into black, and it was full of stars arranged in constellations he didn't recognize. His hands were different, not scarred, not child-thin, but the hands of a grown man, steady and deliberate, with a faint tracery of something that might have been tattoos or might have been scars running from the wrist to the knuckle. He was holding something, not a wand. His palm was flat and upturned, and balanced in it was a sphere of light that breathed in-out like a living thing. The color of it was between gold and white, and it was warm, and it was his, not something he'd summoned, not something he was controlling with effort, but genuinely, fundamentally his, the way his heartbeat was his. Across the plateau, someone else stood in the dark. He couldn't see her clearly, but he knew her. She was working something complex with both hands, geometric patterns traced in light that hung in the air and didn't dissipate, angles and arcs that meant something specific, that carried weight and consequence in a way that casual spellwork never did. Her hair was unbound and the wind was moving it. She paused, glanced back at him and said something in a language he almost potter. He snapped back so hard he nearly stumbled. The classroom was exactly as he'd left it. Crane was looking at him with the mildly suspicious expression of a teacher who has just repeated himself. "Sir," Harry said, "I asked whether you could demonstrate a deflection variant for the class." Crane gestured at the cleared space at the front of the room. "Since you appear to have nothing left to learn from the basic exercise." It was half compliment, half irritation. Harry walked to the front of the class, raised his wand and cast the deflection variant, a rolling shield that redirected force rather than simply absorbing it. He did it correctly, efficiently, and with about 40% of his attention. The other 60 was still on that plateau, the sphere of light that breathed, the hands that weren't his hands except they were. Hermione was in the library at 8:30, which surprised no one, surrounded by books she'd technically already read, which also surprised no one. What would have surprised anyone paying close attention was that she'd been staring at the same page for 20 minutes without turning it. The book was a history of early medieval magical practice, dry as chalk, the kind of text she normally consumed in an hour and filed away with notes. She'd read this particular chapter twice and retain nothing. Her eyes kept sliding off the words. She pressed her fingers against her temples and tried to focus. The problem had started in Transfiguration that morning, a split second during a particularly complex conjuration exercise where her wand had moved through the correct motion and the correct words had been in her mouth, and then her mouth had said something else entirely, something older. The sound of it had surprised her so much she'd actually stopped mid-spell, which was so thoroughly unlike her that it had earned a sharp look from McGonagall. The conjured object had appeared anyway, which was wrong because she hadn't finished the incantation. More than that, it had appeared already complete, fully formed, with a structural integrity that McGonagall had spent a full 20 seconds examining with her wand before declaring it acceptable and moving on. But Hermione had seen the professor's expression in that 20 seconds, not a teacher who'd found acceptable work, a teacher who'd found something she didn't have a category for. Hermione had sat at her desk for the rest of the class feeling like she'd accidentally read a sentence from a book she didn't own. She put down the history text now and reached for parchment, and before she'd consciously decided what she was doing, her hand was moving, not writing, drawing. Diagrams. Geometric progressions of a kind she'd seen referenced in theoretical texts, but never illustrated magical flow architectures, the kind of structural thinking that underpinned why spells worked the way they did, pushed to a level of complexity that was well beyond any WT curriculum. She stopped and looked at what her hand had produced. It was beautiful in the way that a very elegant proof was beautiful, the kind of beauty that lived in precision, in economy of design. Each line was where it needed to be. The angles corresponded to magical resonance harmonics she'd read about in one text, cross-referenced with propagation theory she'd found in another, connected by principles she was fairly sure she'd just invented, except she hadn't, because her hand had drawn the thing before her brain had caught up. She knew what it was, not from reading about it, not from studying it. She knew it the way she knew the grammar of English, not by remembering learning it, but because it was already in her, fundamental and preloaded. It was a binding architecture, a way of weaving multiple magical principles together into a single cohesive working that would be orders of magnitude more stable and powerful than conventional layered spellwork. It was the theoretical foundation that modern transfiguration was a very rough, very simplified child of. She had written it from memory. Except she couldn't have a memory of it because she had never learned it. Granger. She covered the parchment with her arm out of pure reflex. Harry was standing between two shelves with his bag over one shoulder, looking at her with an expression she recognized, the specific look he got when something was deeply wrong and he was determining how wrong before he said anything. She'd catalogued that expression over 5 years of watching it precede catastrophic information. "Harry," she said carefully. "What are you doing here? Couldn't sleep?" He dropped into the chair across from her. "Which is new, I've been sleeping fine." He paused. "Also, Ron said I was doing Wandless lumos in my sleep, which I didn't believe until he showed me his notes." He pulled a folded piece of parchment from his pocket and slid it across the table. On it, in Ron's recognizable scrawl, Harry lit up his entire side of the room at 2 a.m. without touching his wand. "I checked he was asleep first." He was asleep. Hermione looked at the note for a long moment. Then she slid her parchment out from under her arm and put it on the table facing him. Harry looked at the diagrams. He turned the parchment once, orienting it. He studied it for almost a full minute, which meant he was understanding more than he should, because Harry was brilliant in the way that people who'd survived extreme environments were brilliant, adaptive, intuitive, fast, but theoretical magical architecture was not his area. He should have been looking at her drawing the way Ron looked at advanced arithmancy, polite and blank. He wasn't looking at it blankly. "The outer ring is load distribution," he said. Hermione felt the hair on her arms rise. "Yes. And these angles here," he tapped 3 points of intersection, "these are where the working stays stable under pressure. These are the anchors." "Yes." Her voice was very quiet. He looked up at her. In the amber library light, his eyes were doing something odd. They looked for just a second like they belonged to someone older. Not old like tired, old like deep. Like there was more behind them than 16 years could account for. "I had a memory today," he said, "in Dada, except it wasn't my memory. Mine was in transfiguration." She leaned forward. "Harry, I said a word during a conjuration, a word I've never heard in a language I don't know, and the spell worked better than it should have, significantly better. The light I was holding," he said half to himself. "In the memory, it was mine, not like a spell, like breathing," Hermione said. He stared at her. "I know," she said. "I don't know how I know either." The library was very quiet around them. Madame Pince had long since retreated to whatever sealed sanctum librarians disappeared into after hours, and the candles were burning low. Outside the windows, the Black Lake was doing its dark, ancient thing, and Hogwarts was making its small structural noises, settling into night the way a very old building settles. "Tell me the word," Harry said. She hesitated, then said it. Quietly, because the library felt like the right place to be quiet, but clearly enough to be precise. The candlelight reacted, not dramatically, not a roar of flame or an explosion, but every candle within 12 feet simultaneously burned a degree brighter for just a second, as though the sound of the word had fed them. They both looked at the candles, they looked at each other. "Right," Harry said, "so that's a thing." They stayed until well past midnight, which was unusual enough for Harry but had never happened to Hermione in 6 years of Hogwarts. She was not someone who let curfew go unchallenged under normal circumstances, but the conversation that kept unfolding between them had a quality that made stopping feel dangerous, like if they stood up and walked away they might lose the thread and never find it again. Harry described his memory in full. Hermione listened without interrupting, which was its own indicator of how seriously she was taking this. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment with her eyes focused on the middle distance, the specific expression she wore when she was constructing a model of something. "The plateau," she said. "Warm stone, sunset, stars you didn't recognize." "Yeah, I had the same location." She said it carefully as though testing the weight of it. "Not at the same time as you, I don't think. Daytime, very bright. I was inside, mostly a room with open walls, more of a covered terrace, but the stone was the same, the look of it, and I was writing something." She glanced at the diagram. "Not this, something that led to this." "Was there someone else there?" Harry asked. "In yours?" A pause. "Yes, working outside. I could see them from where I was." Another pause. "I couldn't see his face, but I knew who he was." They looked at each other for a beat too long. "We're not jumping to conclusions," Hermione said firmly. I wasn't, Harry said perfectly neutrally. You were thinking it. I think a lot of things doesn't mean I'm jumping to them. She almost smiled, almost. The language, she said, redirecting with visible effort. The word I spoke in Transfiguration, I need to find out if it's a documented proto-magical language or something that predates documentation entirely. There are references in foundational theory texts. Salazar Slytherin and the other founders weren't working from scratch, Harry. They were synthesizing something much older. Most historians treat the pre-founder period as a gap, but it wasn't a gap, it was just forgotten, Harry said, or deliberately obscured. She tapped the diagram. I drew this before I understood what it was. That's not how learning works. You don't know a thing before you learn it, unless you already knew it. The word hung between them, already, past tense knowing, a knowing that predated this life's learning. I need access to the restricted section, Hermione said. Her voice had shifted, less uncertain, more purposeful, the tone she used when a problem had become a project. Not the reading list for it, the deep archive. There are texts that Dumbledore himself restricted because they were, she paused, too dangerous, Harry offered, too old, which isn't the same thing. Dumbledore restricts dangerous books because he doesn't want students blowing themselves up, which is reasonable. But these texts aren't restricted because they're dangerous. They're restricted because they'd raise questions he'd rather not answer. She folded the diagram and tucked it into her bag with a precision that meant she considered it important. I was never sure how I knew that. I assumed it was inference. Maybe it was memory, Harry said. She met his eyes. Maybe it was. The candles burned low around them. Outside, the lake was dark and the castle was quiet, and somewhere in the deep architecture of Hogwarts, in the stones that had been placed before the founders, in the foundations that predated the name, something that had been dormant for a very long time turned over in its sleep, like an enormous animal feeling the first change in season. Neither of them felt it, not quite. But both of them, independently, felt the distinct sensation of standing at the edge of something vast. The following day had the deceitful quality of normalcy. Potions with Slughorn, who was in good form and particularly effusive about Hermione's Amortentia sample, which she reduced to its base compounds and rebuilt from scratch with such economy of technique that even Harry noticed it was unusual. She didn't look particularly pleased by Slughorn's praise. She looked like someone being praised for their long division. Astronomy was straightforward. Charms was interesting. Hermione's summoning charm in the intermediate exercise moved so fast the object reached her before Professor Flitwick had finished saying begin, which created a brief, startled silence in the classroom before Flitwick recovered and made a note on his clipboard with an expression that Harry, watching from 2 stations down, couldn't quite read. Flying practice in the afternoon was the first real anomaly. It happened during a standard formation drill, pairs flying in coordinated patterns, the kind of teamwork exercise that the Gryffindor Quidditch reserves needed badly and that Harry was helping supervise. He was circling about 30 feet up when Demelza Robbins hit a pocket of wind badly, lost her broom's stability, and began to fall, not a gentle wobble but a real fast wrong-angle fall, the kind that in 30 feet of open air between broom and stone would result in a trip to the hospital wing at minimum. Harry didn't summon his broom's speed. He didn't think about the wand at his hip or the summoning charm or any of the tools available to him. He reached out one hand, palm up, and caught her from 20 feet away, not caught her physically. The air around Demelza thickened and cushioned and stopped her gently but with absolute certainty, the way you'd catch a glass you'd knocked off a table. She settled to the ground, standing upright, looking mildly confused. The dozen students present were completely silent for a moment. Harry landed. He was aware of his heart rate, which was entirely normal. He was aware that his wand was still in its holster. He was aware of 12 pairs of eyes in the afternoon sun and the sound of the wind in the courtyard. Good save, said Coot finally, with the baffled admiration of someone who had decided not to think too hard about what he'd just seen. Thanks, Harry said, and that was that. It was not that. He knew it was not that. He'd felt the working leave him with the same unconscious completeness as the Lumos in his sleep, except this time he'd been fully awake and fully present, and he'd done it in front of witnesses. It had required nothing from him except the decision that it should happen, and the decision had been so instant as to be almost pre-verbal, the way you'd blink if something flew at your face. A reflex, except the reflex was raw, architectural magic of a kind that wands weren't involved in and never had been. He found Hermione in the corridor outside the Great Hall before dinner with such purposeful stride that she stopped walking and turned to face him before he'd said a word. Quidditch practice, he said. She read his expression. What happened, he told her. Concisely, accurately, with the kind of detail that mattered, the absence of wand use, the instinctive quality of it, the ease. Harry, she said quietly, listen to me. In charms today, the summoning charm, I felt the spell before I cast it, the path it was going to take, not predicted. I could feel the architecture of it, the way you can feel the structure of a sentence before you say it. She paused. I didn't use the incantation, I used the structure, the actual underlying working. Without speaking it, without anything, one motion only, and I'm not sure the one motion was strictly necessary. Around them, students were filing past toward the Great Hall, the noise and warmth of dinner pulling people like gravity. Harry and Hermione stood slightly to one side of the flow, speaking quietly enough that the hallway traffic swept past them without paying attention. "We should be more careful," Hermione said, and her tone made clear this wasn't because she was afraid. It was the tone of someone who'd decided on a strategy, not hiding it but choosing when. "And in the meantime, I need that restricted section access. Dumbledore would give you permission if you asked with the right framing," Harry said. "I know, but he'd also know what I was looking for, which means he'd know what was happening to us before we've had time to understand it ourselves." Her jaw was set. "I'd like to understand it first." Harry thought about the tone Dumbledore used when he was steering a conversation with the gentle, inevitable quality of a river. He thought about the number of times things had been kept from him for his own protection. He thought about the sphere of light in his upturned palm, breathing entirely his. "Okay," he said. "Without Dumbledore then, how?" The corner of Hermione's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, closer to the expression of someone who has already thought 3 steps ahead and is inviting you to keep up. "I've been in this library for 6 years, she said. "I know where every book is, including the ones Filch hasn't catalogued properly because they've been there longer than the current cataloguing system. And I know that the restricted section has a back wall, not a door, just a wall that separates it from the archive room that hasn't been on any official floor plan since 1842. You found a secret room. I found a discrepancy in the building's documented dimensions that implies a secret room, yes." She said it with complete composure. "I've known about it for 2 years. I've been waiting for a reason to investigate it. And now you have one. And now we have one." Dinner was loud and ordinary, and Ron spent most of it talking about the Chudley Cannon's frankly delusional prospects for the season, which Harry engaged with on autopilot while his mind moved through other spaces. He ate without tasting much, which wasn't unusual, and watched Hermione across the table simultaneously reading, eating, and maintaining enough of the conversation to satisfy anyone watching, which was entirely usual but now read differently. Now it read as someone managing multiple tracks of consciousness simultaneously, sorting information, processing, not performing intelligence, exercising it. He watched McGonagall at the staff table, the memory of the sharp look she'd given Hermione in Transfiguration. He wondered what McGonagall really knew, not academically but in the bone-deep way that very old witches sometimes knew things. He wondered if there were people at this table who had been waiting in some form for this specific thing to happen to Harry and Hermione without necessarily understanding what they were waiting for. He kept his face relaxed and ate his food. "You've gone quiet," Ron said. "Just thinking about Quidditch," Harry said, which wasn't a lie, just the smallest possible fraction of the truth. "Brilliant, because I need a second keeper for the reserve." "Oh, Harry, speaking of, Ginny said she saw you stop Demels's fall today without a wand. She said it looked like wind caught her," Harry said. "She was close enough to the ground that the momentum had mostly died." He said it easily, not hurriedly, with just enough technical detail to satisfy without inviting examination. "Scared me, though." Ron made a sympathetic noise and moved on. Ginny, further down the table, glanced at Harry with an expression that said she had not been satisfied by the wind explanation, but she filed it and moved on too. Hermione, across from him, had not looked up from her book, but her quill had paused. They went at 2 in the morning. Harry's invisibility cloak had comfortably covered 2 people before, had in fact been used for exactly this kind of unsanctioned library mission in their first year, in what felt like a different lifetime, which apparently now had more weight than he'd appreciated. The castle was deep in its nighttime self. Not silent, it never was, but the sounds were ambient, structural. The creak of old wood, the distant complaint of a portrait shifted by draft, somewhere below the sound of water in pipes. The torches in the corridors had burned down to orange coals. Peeves was mercifully elsewhere. Filch, by the map Harry had consulted before they left, was 3 floors down and stationary. Hermione led. He followed at her shoulder, the cloak pulled close, her wand producing just enough light to navigate by. She moved through the library's outer door unlocked because she'd noticed 5 years ago that the lock was decorative, and into the main stacks without hesitating. The restricted section was at the back, separated by a low rope and a series of detection charms that Hermione disarmed with 3 motions so quick and quiet that Harry almost missed them. "When did you learn that?" he murmured. "4th year," she said, equally low. "In case of emergencies." He decided not to ask what emergencies she'd been anticipating in 4th year. She moved through the restricted section without stopping, past shelves of books that muttered and shifted in their sleep to the back wall. She ran her wand along the wall slowly, left to right at about shoulder height. "Here," she said, barely audible. He felt it before she pointed to it, a seam in the magical texture of the wall, the place where 2 workings didn't quite meet. It felt like a fault line under the surface, the kind of structural imprecision that meant something had been added and not perfectly integrated. He put his hand on the wall and felt along the seam. It was old, not Hogwarts old, which was already significant. Older. The magic in it had the quality of something built before the current frameworks existed, not primitive, nothing as simple as that. Foundational, the same quality as the diagrams in Hermione's drawing, preceding, not predating. He pushed. The wall didn't open like a door. It stepped aside, the stone rearranging itself with the unhurried certainty of something that had been waiting for an appropriate prompt, like a lock recognizing a key, except there was no key, just the specific quality of his attention. The room beyond was small, stone shelved, cool with the specific cool of deep preservation, the way museum rooms were cool. The shelves held perhaps 30 objects, some books, some scrolls, some things that weren't quite either, materials he didn't have names for. Hermione made a small sound, not a frightened sound, the sound of someone finding something they'd been looking for longer than they'd consciously realized. She moved to the nearest shelf and picked up one of the scrolls. It was a very dark material, almost black in Hermione's wand light, the kind of scroll that had been written on by a hand that pressed firmly and confidently. She unrolled a section carefully and held the light close. The script was nothing Harry recognized, not any of the dozen writing systems he'd encountered through Hermione's cultural overviews, not rune variants, not anything. It was clean and exact, and had the quality of something that had been written by a person who thought in that script the way Harry thought in English, deeply, natively, without translation. "I can read it," Hermione said. She said it in the same tone she might say the house is on fire, perfectly level, because the situation was serious enough that panic was a waste of resources. "What does it say?" Harry asked. She read in silence for a moment, lips just barely moving. Her face in the wand light was doing something complicated, moving through sequences of expression that Harry couldn't fully track. Not fear, not exactly, recognition maybe, the specific expression of encountering something true that you hadn't expected to find confirmed. "It says," she said slowly, "that the working is contained but not extinguished, that the vessels were chosen for stability and compatibility, that the fracture was deliberate, and that the seal will break when the anchors are placed in proximity." She paused. "And then it says something that I need to read again." She read it again, then she looked at Harry. "Harry," she said, "I think I wrote this." The archive room was very quiet. The preservation cold was sitting around them, and the wand light was amber steady, and somewhere far above them Hogwarts went about its nighttime breathing. Harry didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the scroll, at the confident script that he couldn't read but that his hands were suddenly aware of in the way you're aware of your own handwriting, the specific pressure rhythm of it, the angle of individual letters. He was aware that his pulse was entirely even, that he was not frightened. That instead of frightened, he felt something much more like the moment before a chess game begins, when the board is set and the positions are known and the question is simply whether you're ready to play. "How long ago?" he asked. "Thousands of years," Hermione said. "The dating markers in the header, I know what they mean. I don't know how they correspond to a period well before the founder era, before Roman Britain, before," she stopped. "Before most of what we'd call history," Harry said. "Yes." She was looking at him in the wand light. "We've been here before, not Hogwarts, here, this situation, the two of us in a dark room with something vast beginning to wake up." She said it with a kind of wry steadiness because Hermione, when confronted with the genuinely impossible, preferred to acknowledge it calmly and then work the problem. "I think that's the part I'm least surprised by." Harry thought about this. He thought about the plateau, the warm stone, the sphere of light in his palm. "The word you said in Transfiguration," he said. "Say it again." She did, still quiet but clearly. The lights in the archive room responded, not just the wand, the room itself, the deep-set stones in the walls responded with a faint and steady luminescence, the kind of light that suggested it had been there all along, waiting for the right acoustic key. The shelves were fully visible now. The scrolls and books and objects on them were visible. One object on the highest shelf was glowing already. Had been glowing before the word, they realized, but too faintly to see in the wand light. Now it was visible, a flat stone disc, not large, with a marking on it that Harry's eyes moved over and away from in the way eyes moved over optical illusions, never quite settling. Neither of them moved toward it, not yet. "We're not jumping to conclusions," Hermione said again, but her voice had a different quality this time. Less caution, more ritual. Like saying it was necessary even if they both already knew where this was going. "No," Harry agreed, equally ritualistic. They looked at the glowing disc on the highest shelf. "We're going to need more time in here," Hermione said. "We're going to need a lot of things," Harry said. The archive room sat quiet around them, alive with the patience of very old things. Outside, the castle breathed. The lake turned in its dark. The Scottish hills held the last of their September warmth against the coming cold. And in the bones of Hogwarts, in the pre-founder stones, in the deliberate geometries of its foundations, in the deep architecture that no modern text described correctly because no modern text had been written by someone who remembered, something that had been counting down for a very long time reached a new number and kept counting. Chapter 2, What the Stone Remembers. The disc was warm. That was the first thing Harry noticed when he lifted it from the shelf, not the weight of it, which was negligible, not the smoothness of the material, which was something between stone and glass that didn't have a name in anything he'd studied. The warmth. It came from inside it the way body heat came from inside a person, radiating outward with a steadiness that suggested ongoing process rather than stored temperature, like holding something alive. The marking on its face was still doing its optical illusion thing, deflecting direct attention. Harry stopped trying to look at it directly and used his peripheral vision instead, the same technique he used to see the Strals, And after a moment the mark resolved not into a symbol he recognized, but into something his hands recognized. His fingers moved over it without instruction, tracing the lines, and the warmth intensified slightly at each touch point, like an instrument responding to a familiar player. "Don't do anything dramatic with it," Hermione said, which was arguably the most Hermione sentence in the English language. "I'm just holding it." "You're doing more than just holding it." She was watching the disc with her head tilted, the expression she wore in arithmancy when an equation was resolving towards something unexpected. "Your wand is reacting." He glanced at his hip. The wand in its holster was vibrating faintly, not the aggressive vibration of conflicting magical fields, but the resonant hum of a system recognizing a larger system, like a tuning fork finding its note. "Interesting," Hermione said. "That's one word for it." She reached out and touched the edge of the disc, not taking it from him, just making contact. The warmth spiked immediately, one quick pulse, and the luminescence in the room brightened a full degree. In the better light, Harry could see the shelves more completely now, and what he saw rearranged several assumptions. These weren't random, restricted texts. They were organized not alphabetically, not by subject in any system he could name, but by something else, something structural. The arrangement had the quality of a sentence or a proof, objects placed in relationship to each other rather than simply stored. Someone had built an argument in here in three-dimensional space and then hidden it. "We can't take the disc," Hermione said, and he could hear her working through the reasoning as she spoke. "If Filch or Dumbledore does a sweep and finds it missing, they know someone's been here, and we need time to understand what we're looking at before anyone knows we've found it." "Agreed." Set the disc back on its shelf, placed carefully where it had been, and the room's ambient glow dimmed back to the edge of visibility. "The scrolls, though, the ones you can read. I can't take them either, but I can memorize them." She was already moving to the nearest shelf, unrolling the first scroll with the careful speed of someone who'd spent years training her memory. "Go through the books, not all of them. Look for anything with that script, that specific line quality. You'll recognize it." "I can't read it, Hermione." "You don't need to read it, you need to find it." She glanced at him. "You'll know." She was right, which was interesting in itself. He moved along the shelves and within a minute had identified 4 books that had that specific quality, text that felt, when he picked them up, like finding his own notes from a class he'd forgotten taking. He couldn't read the script inside, but his hands moved to specific pages with the same unthinking accuracy he used to find the snitch, and on those pages consistently were diagrams, different from Hermione's binding architecture but related to it, the way different chapters of the same book were related, working schemas, spatial reasoning mapped onto magical theory with a precision that modern spell design didn't approach. He didn't memorize them consciously. He looked at them and they went in the way things went in when you were genuinely interested rather than studying deep and immediate and lasting. They were there for 40 minutes. When they left, the room resealed behind them with the same quiet certainty with which it had opened. The restricted section slept on around them, books murmuring. Filch was still 3 floors down. The castle breathed. They walked back through the dark under the cloak and didn't speak until they'd reached the corridor outside Gryffindor Tower, where Hermione stopped and turned to him with that particular quality of focus she had when she'd arrived at a conclusion she needed to say out loud in order to fully believe. "The scroll I read," she said quietly. "The one I apparently wrote. Harry, it wasn't a record, it was instructions for us for this. Written by someone who knew we wouldn't remember everything, that we'd remember enough to find our way back but not enough to know what to do next. Harry processed this, so past us left present us a guide and a warning." She paused. "The last section of the scroll, I need to go back for it, I didn't finish, but the beginning is very clear on one thing. This isn't the first time we've come back, we've done this before multiple times." She held his gaze. "And each time there's a point where someone tries to stop us, before we fully remember, because fully remembered we're difficult to stop," Harry said. "More than that." She said it simply, without self-aggrandizement, just the flat accuracy of someone reading a specification sheet. "The wording is, it says the anchors at full resonance are without ceiling. That's a direct translation. Without ceiling." He turned that over. In magical theory, the concept of ceilings was foundational. Every witch or wizard had a power threshold, a functional maximum which could be trained toward but never truly exceeded. It was why Voldemort, for all his ambition, was still quantifiably bounded. It was why Dumbledore, for all his genuine brilliance, was still finite. The ceiling was how magical society made sense of itself, calibrated its hierarchies, decided who was safe. Without ceiling was a thing that wasn't supposed to exist. "We should sleep," Hermione said. "We think better rested." But she was already doing that thing where she was obviously not going to sleep for hours, the thing where her eyes went slightly distant as her mind kept working on a problem her body was supposedly taking a break from. "Right," Harry said. "Good night, Harry. Night, Hermione." He went up to the boys' dormitory and lay in the dark listening to Ron's steady breathing and looking at the ceiling, and the sphere of light from his memory pulsed behind his eyes, warm and breathing, and he thought, without ceiling. He didn't sleep for a very long time. Dumbledore noticed on a Tuesday, which was perhaps appropriate, because Tuesdays at Hogwarts had a specific administrative quality, the day of the week when reports landed on desks and patterns became visible in accumulated data. He was in his office reviewing the week's staff observations, a practice he maintained with the regularity of someone who understood that information management was the real work of running an institution, when Flitwick's note caught his attention. Miss Granger performed a summoning charm without audible incantation during the intermediate exercise. Object arrived before the exercise began. Structural quality of the working was, I'm not certain how to describe this, Albus. It was correct in a way that goes beyond advanced. I've attached my wand resonance reading. I expect you'll want to see it. Dumbledore looked at the attached reading for a long time. Then he set it aside and picked up McGonagall's, which he'd almost skipped because Minerva was not typically one for editorial comment, and he'd assumed it would be routine. The transfiguration incident with Miss Granger is attached. What you'll want to note is not the quality of the conjured object, though that is remarkable enough. It's the word she used mid-spell. I caught it clearly. It is not Latin. It is not any variant of the Indo-European magical root languages. I've cross-referenced it with Spellman's etymological dictionary and Boswell's proto-magical linguistics and found nothing. I am deeply familiar with what I don't recognize, Albus. This I don't recognize, and I know that I should. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, hands folded on his desk, his half-moon spectacles casting small crescents of reflected light on the surface below. Through the window behind him, the grounds were grey and ordinary in early October. The castle went about its business. From the reports he'd received over the past 3 days, which he now reread in sequence, Flitwick, McGonagall, Sprout mentioning that Mr. Potter had done something unusual with a failing plant in herbology that he'd apparently not noticed himself doing, Sinistra noting that both Potter and Granger had independently identified 3 stars in the astronomy tower that weren't on any current chart and had offered their coordinates without being asked. From all of this, a pattern emerged that Dumbledore recognized the way you recognize a face from a very old photograph, not the specific shape of it, the type. He had been old enough and had read widely enough to know what this type was. He sat for a long time. Fawkes watched him from the perch with one gold eye. The office ticked and shimmered around him with decades of accumulated magical objects, each one a trophy of a life spent in proximity to extraordinary things, and Dumbledore sat among them feeling, for the first time in quite a long while, genuinely uncertain what to do. Then he reached for parchment and began composing his note to Professor Crane. Harry was in the middle of a particularly tedious free period on Wednesday afternoon when the memory hit him hard enough that he had to sit down. He'd been walking back from the greenhouses with mud on his boots and a largely successful attempt at a repotting charm still pleasantly in his hands, mentally planning an approach to Hermione's archive problem, when the vision came in not through the dreamlike slow motion of the first time, but as a clear, present, complete recollection. He was sitting across a fire from a man he knew. The man was older than him, older than the body Harry currently inhabited, certainly, but in the memory Harry himself was not a teenager. He was a man full grown, and the age difference between them was something measured in decades, not years. The man had the look of someone whose great power had become institutional. You could see it in the way he held himself, the way he managed the space around him, the careful positioning that said, I am accustomed to being the largest thing in this room. He was speaking, his language was the language of the scroll, and Harry could hear it, not remember it or translate it, actually hear it, the memory so clear that the sounds were real. He was saying that the work should stop, that it had gone far enough. That there were those who watched and worried that the balance of things was delicate, and that for everyone's sake, for your sake, said Harry's memory voice, which was his voice and not his voice, the same frequency but more settled, don't mistake your concern for authority over what we're doing. The man smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are doing something else. The kind of smile Dumbledore wore sometimes. I don't mistake it, said the man, I simply note it. Harry's memory self looked at him across the fire for a moment, then, noted. He came back to himself on a stone bench near the greenhouses, sitting because his legs had made a sensible decision without consulting him. The October afternoon was sharp and clear around him. 2 Hufflepuff second years were giving him a wide berth on the path, looking at him the way students looked at Harry Potter when he appeared to be having an intense internal experience with the specific Hogwarts mix of concern and determined non-involvement. He sat until his heart rate finished settling, then stood and walked to the library. Hermione was already there. She looked up when he came in, read his face, and closed her book. Memory, she said. Clear one, the best yet. He sat down across from her. I saw the man, the one who wanted us to stop. She went very still. Describe him. He did. The age difference, the institutional quality of the man's power, the careful management of space, the smile, and the specific exchange. Hermione listened without moving, and when he'd finished she reached into her bag and produced the fresh parchment she'd been filling since their first night in the archive, the pages of transcribed scroll text and diagrams accumulating into something that was starting to look like a dossier. I've been dreaming the memories, she said, not just waking visions, dreams. Every night this week I've been keeping notes. She found a specific page. 3 nights ago I dreamed a conversation with a man who matches your description exactly. The exchange was different. He came to me, not to us together, and he was more direct. He said that what Kalian and Seraphil were building posed a risk to the established order. She looked up at him. It was the first time either of them had said the names out loud. Kalian, Harry said, testing the weight of it. Seraphil, she replied with the exact same quality. Then briskly, because feeling the reality of it required movement. He wasn't wrong, technically. What we were building did pose a risk to the established order. But the established order at that time was not great, Harry guessed. There was a structure of magical practice that concentrated power in the hands of about 30 individuals who had, over several generations, deliberately suppressed any form of magical development they didn't control. Not because they were evil, the motivations were genuinely complex: preservation of stability, fear of what unconstrained magical development might produce, and yes, self-interest, which they dressed up in enough genuine philosophy to make it hard to separate out. She set the notes down. Kalian and Seraphil were building something that would break that structure open. Not violently, the work was architectural, theoretical. The effect would have been that anyone with magical ability would have had access to a foundation of practice that the 30 couldn't manage or restrict. So democratizing it, Harry said. Yes, and the man by the fire in both our memories was one of the 30, not the most powerful, not the most vicious, but the most politically sophisticated, the one who understood that the most effective opposition to a genuinely dangerous idea was early, polite, and expressed as concern rather than command. Harry looked at her. You realize what you're describing? A beat. Yes, I've been thinking about it all week. She folded her hands on the table with a precision that was its own kind of emotional containment. Dumbledore isn't him, I want to be clear about that. The historical parallel isn't a direct equivalence. But the structural position is the same: a person of genuine intelligence and real achievement who has become so identified with being the authority on power that they can't survive psychologically the existence of something they didn't authorize. And with a thing he didn't authorize. We're becoming it, she said carefully. We're not there yet. Harry thought about the vision, the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the word noted that had felt, even in memory, like the closing of a door. We need to go back to the archive, he said. Tonight, she agreed. I need the rest of that scroll. They didn't make it that night, because Wednesday evenings, as Harry had forgotten until Ron bellowed it across the common room at 7:30, were when Dumbledore held his private lessons with Harry. He'd nearly missed it. He genuinely couldn't remember the last time he'd forgotten a Dumbledore appointment, which said something about how thoroughly the past week had reorganized his interior landscape. He changed robes, found his bag, and arrived at the stone gargle with approximately 90 seconds to spare, entirely composed. The office was exactly as it always was, cluttered with significance, warm with firelight, Fawkes watchful on his perch. Dumbledore was standing at the pensive when Harry entered, his back partially turned, the silver bowl of memory doing its slow luminescent churn. Harry, he said warmly, turning. Sit down, please. Tea. Thank you, Professor. The ritual of tea. The settling into chairs, the office performing its function as a space designed to produce ease and trust. Harry sat and accepted the cup and drank, and watched Dumbledore over the rim with an attention he was careful to make look like ordinary student attentiveness. Dumbledore had spent the last 6 years being the most perceptive person in any room Harry entered. The experience of sitting across from him and feeling, for the first time, roughly level, not superior, genuinely level, was strange enough to require conscious management. I've been reflecting, Dumbledore began with the tone of a man who reflected often and productively, on the nature of magical development. In particular, and you must forgive an old man his philosophical detours, the relationship between what we might call innate capacity and developed skill. Harry waited. Most witches and wizards develop primarily through practice and instruction, Dumbledore continued, his blue eyes moving over Harry with a care that was real and a calculation that was equally real. But there are cases, rare, fascinating cases, where development appears to occur through a different pathway, less linear, less responsive to the usual methods. He paused. Have you noticed anything unusual in your magical practice recently, Harry? And there it was. Clean, early, dressed in genuine curiosity. Harry looked at Dumbledore and saw the architecture of the question, the way it had been placed there not to receive an honest answer but to establish whether Harry was aware enough to recognize that it was being placed. He thought of the vision, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. I've been finding the shield charms easier, Harry said. Crane mentioned I'd moved past the basic level. I think I've just been practicing more. A fractional pause. Almost invisible. Indeed, and how are you sleeping? Fine, thanks, better than last year, actually. Another pause, this one differently textured, a calculation being updated. Good, that's very good. Dumbledore set down his own cup. Shall we begin? I wanted to show you something in the pensive, a memory of Voldemort in his early years at this school, which I think will give you useful context for understanding the way his current strategy is likely to develop. They spent the remaining hour in memory. Voldemort at 16, vicious and brilliant and contained, performing for the people around him while the real work happened somewhere behind his eyes where no one could follow. Harry watched carefully, and what he understood from watching had less to do with the tactics and more to do with the pattern, the specific kind of intelligence that was entirely occupied with managing others' perceptions. That spent most of its energy building the room it wanted rather than engaging honestly with the room that existed. He recognized it, not from memory, from the past week. Walking back through the corridors to Gryffindor Tower afterward, Harry turned the lesson over with the methodical attention of someone who has realized that the subject of the lesson might not have been Voldemort. The archive on Thursday night yielded more than either of them expected. Hermione reached the end of the first scroll and found it connected, literally connected, by a folded section she'd missed, to a second scroll, and the second one contained what she'd been looking for, the warning. She translated aloud in a low voice while Harry kept watch with one ear toward the restricted section. Her voice was steady, but her hands, he noticed, were very slightly not. The trigger for resumption is proximity and recognition. The anchors placed in the same space will recall each other across time, which is by design, but the recall will be gradual, and the period of gradual recall is the period of greatest danger. She paused. During this period, those who benefit from the existing order will sense the disturbance before the anchors understand what they are sensing. This is not a flaw. It was considered and accepted. The disruption caused by full immediate recall would be catastrophically destabilizing for a mind not prepared. The gradual return is protective, but it means that for a time, possibly weeks, the anchors are in the position of knowing enough to be visible and not enough to be invulnerable. She looked up. The archive was very still around them. Visible and not enough to be invulnerable, Harry said. We're in the window, she said. We're in the exact period the scroll is warning about. He processed this with a calm that was, he recognized, partly Calian and partly himself, the two overlapping now in a way that was becoming natural rather than strange. What does it say about how long the window is? It doesn't specify. It says it closes when the resonance completes. She looked back at the scroll. The next section talks about the resonance completion process. She stopped. Read ahead, lips moving slightly, stopped again. Hermione, it's us, she said. The resonance completion is us, the two anchors. It's not a ritual, it's not a process we have to perform deliberately. It happens when both anchors are fully present to each other. When there's no, it uses a word I'm translating roughly as concealment. When there's no concealment between the anchors, she set the scroll down very carefully, which is a statement about the nature of the bond between them, between Calian and Seraphil. It says that the separation between lives was only possible because the bond was deliberately suppressed as part of the fractioning, and the full return requires unsuppressing it. The archive room was cool and quiet, and Harry was acutely aware of exactly how small it was. Right, he said. Yes, she said. They were both looking at the wall opposite. This seemed, by unspoken mutual agreement, like the appropriate direction. We don't have to address that immediately, Hermione said, with the tone of someone imposing a sensible deferral on a topic that was, in fact, seismic. Completely agree, Harry said immediately. We have more important things to understand first. Absolutely. Good. She picked the scroll back up. Moving on. The next section was about the fracture itself, the deliberate process by which Calian and Seraphil, at the end of their lives, had disassembled the accumulated knowledge and distributed it, not lost it, distributed it, encoded into the structures they built, the foundations they laid, the people they taught, hidden in plain sight in the architecture of a world that would spend millennia standing on what they'd built without knowing who had laid the ground. Hogwarts, Harry said. The word arrived before the full thought had assembled. The foundations, Hermione confirmed. Not all of it. The castle is medieval. The founders built the superstructure, but the site, the reason this site was chosen and the specific way the wards were anchored and the layout of the deepest levels, they built it on top of something we made. We built it on top of something Calian and Seraphil made, and then we, the founders, incorporating our distributed knowledge without fully understanding where it came from, built Hogwarts on top of that, and embedded the archive in it and the disc and set the trigger for the next return. She took a breath. We've been planning this for a very long time. Harry looked at the disc on its high shelf, glowing its patient faint glow in the dark. Pick it up, Hermione said. I thought we weren't taking anything. We're not taking it, but I've been looking at the scroll's description of it and I think pick it up. He reached up and took the disc from its shelf. It was warm as before, immediately and intimately, and the marking on its face did its peripheral vision trick, resolving when he stopped looking directly at it. Turn it over, Hermione said. He did. The reverse side was plain except for a single line of the ancient script near the outer edge. Hermione leaned close and read it, lips moving. Return this to the foundation when the resonance is complete. She looked up at him, and in the archive's light her expression was the specific one she wore when a very large equation resolved into a satisfying answer. We made it. We hid it here. We left instructions for retrieving it and returning it to Hogwarts Foundations, which would, I need to read more to be certain, but I think it would complete the work we were doing when we were interrupted. Complete it several thousand years late, Harry said. Better late than not at all. She was already moving back to the scrolls. There are at least 4 more of these I haven't gotten through yet, and the books you identified, I haven't touched those. She was already pulling one from the shelf, opening it with hands that were entirely steady now. The slightly not steadiness from earlier had been replaced by focus, the deep, driving focus that was Hermione Granger's most fundamental characteristic, sharpened now to a point that had several thousand years of precedent behind it. Harry sat on the floor of the archive with his back against the shelving and the disc in his hands and watched her read and translate, the ancient script moving through her like a native language returning from disuse, and the disc under his hands breathed its steady warm breath, and outside Hogwarts kept its own council in the dark. They stayed until nearly 4. When they finally reshelved everything and sealed the archive and made their way back through the castle's nighttime corridors, the sky outside the high windows was beginning the very faint lightening that was still 2 hours from sunrise, but was the first hint that night had a direction. What's the most important thing we know now that we didn't know yesterday? Harry asked quietly, the question he'd developed a habit of asking Hermione at the end of intensive research sessions because she inevitably answered with something precisely calibrated. She thought for a moment. That the window is closing whether we hurry it or not, she said. The recall is continuing regardless of what we do. In a few more weeks we'll have most of it back. She paused. And that whoever laid the trigger because someone did, Harry. The conditions for our reawakening in this specific time were engineered. It wasn't accidental that Harry Potter and Hermione Granger ended up at Hogwarts at this age in this era. Someone set this up. Dumbledore, Harry said. I don't think so. He's reacting, not orchestrating. He's surprised. She was quiet for a moment. Whoever laid the trigger knew we'd come back in a time when the need was real, when there was something that needed the full working to be completed. She glanced at him. Voldemort's return, the war building. Someone thousands of years ago saw the pattern of a world that needed what we built and set the clock. Who would have had that kind of foresight? Harry said. Hermione almost smiled. We would, she said. Harry thought about this for the rest of the walk back to Gryffindor Tower, about the version of himself that had been old enough and far-seeing enough to set in motion a return spanning millennia, to place the trigger in the right bloodline in the right century, to hide the archive in a castle that wouldn't exist for thousands of years in a country that didn't have that name yet. To trust that future Harry and future Hermione, waking up confused in a school in Scotland, would find their way to the dark room and the warm disc and the scrolls. He thought about the patience of it, the depth of the plan, and he thought, I must have trusted her to plan it this way, the resonance requiring both anchors, the return being mutual. He hadn't laid this plan alone, neither had she. They'd built it together, and the return was built for both of them, and there was something in that, in the fact of the ancient planning itself, that he couldn't quite look at directly either, for the same reason he couldn't look directly at the disc's marking. Something that resolved when you stopped trying to look at it head-on. The portrait hole swung open for them. The common room was dark and empty and warm with dying fire. Ron's chess set sat abandoned on the table, mid-game, frozen in the specific position it reached when Ron went to bed with the conviction that his strategy would still be brilliant in the morning. Hermione paused at the foot of the stairs, bag over her shoulder, looking slightly otherworldly in the firelight, the barely there luminescence of someone whose interior landscape was larger than the room she was standing in. Harry, she said, whatever comes next, we don't let anyone else set the terms. Not Dumbledore, not Voldemort, not the 30, nobody. Nobody, Harry agreed without any qualification at all. She went upstairs. He stayed a moment looking at the dying fire, the disc's warmth still in the memory of his hands. Outside, the grounds were dark and cold, and the castle was enormous around him, all its medieval stones laid over older stones, over a foundation that 2 people had built long ago and left for themselves to find. He went upstairs and slept immediately and dreamed the plateau in full, every detail sharp, the warm stone and the stars and seraphils patterns hanging in the air, and woke at dawn feeling less like himself than he had in years, which was to say, more like himself than he had in years. The two things were not a contradiction, not anymore. 3 floors down and in the East Wing, in an office surrounded by the accumulated significance of a long life, Dumbledore sat by his window watching the sun come up with a cup of cold tea in his hand, and a weight behind his eyes that Fawkes, watching from the perch, understood as the specific variety of human distress that came from seeing something coming and not knowing how to be ready for it. He had lived a very long life. He had seen extraordinary things. He had been by any reasonable measurement the most powerful wizard of his age, an age he'd spent in the main trying to ensure that magical society survived its own worst impulses. He was sitting with the certainty growing quietly but firmly since Tuesday's reports that his age was ending, not in the sense of defeat, not in the sense of loss. He was too honest in his private moments for the kind of self-serving catastrophizing that would have made this about his own diminishment. In the sense of change, of a thing that had been building for a long time arriving at its natural conclusion, of a chapter which had been meaningful and necessary and in which he had done genuinely important work closing. The question, and it was the question, the one he'd been avoiding since Tuesday and now had to face in the early morning quiet, was whether he would be a figure who helped the next chapter open cleanly, or one who complicated the transition. He thought, not for the first time and with more honesty than usual, about what he knew and what he'd chosen not to share, and about the 12-year-old he'd set at the top of a very long staircase and told, in essence, that the destination was worth the climb. Harry Potter was no longer climbing cautiously. He sipped his cold tea. Well, he said to Fawkes quietly with the tone of a man whose best quality was that he always, eventually, was honest with himself. We'll need to be careful. Fawkes made a sound that was not entirely reassuring. Outside, the grounds emerged from darkness into grey morning, the lake silver and still, the hills holding their shapes against the lightning sky, and deep in the castle's bones, in the pre-founder foundations, in the geometry of a working laid by hands that had also laid these two sleeping minds, something turned over once more, and the Count moved forward, and the window grew smaller, and the light got ready. Chapter 3. The language before Latin. The first time Harry performed old magic in public, he didn't intend to. It was a Friday morning in the third week of October, the kind of morning where the Scottish weather had stopped pretending and committed fully to cold, fog sitting in the lower grounds, and the castle windows running with condensation. Breakfast in the great hall was loud and warm and crowded, and Harry was eating toast and listening to Ron describe a chaser maneuver with the particular animated certainty of someone who had never once executed said maneuver, but understood it theoretically with great conviction. Hermione was across the table making notes on something that was definitely not homework. Harry could see from the angle he was sitting that the parchment had the dense, compact handwriting she used for archival transcription rather than the more expansive style of her academic work. She had 3 books open in a semicircle around her plate, and she was eating a piece of fruit without looking at it, which he'd watched her do before but now understood differently. Seraphil had likely read and eaten simultaneously on that terrace. Some patterns were older than their current bodies. He was thinking about this, about how many small habits might be echoes, how deep the grooves of a past life ran, when Draco Malfoy walked past the Gryffindor table. This was not by itself unusual. The route from the Slytherin table to the doors passed within 10 feet of where Harry was sitting, and Malfoy had been using it all term with the specific studied nonchalance of someone who wanted it known that proximity to Harry Potter wasn't something he found meaningful. Lately there had been something else in it too, a tension that ran under the nonchalance like a structural fault, the way you could feel a crack in stone before you saw it. What was unusual this morning was that Malfoy stopped. Not next to Harry. He stopped just behind Hermione's chair, and he looked at her notes on the table, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not the theatrical contempt he usually performed, but something more genuine and therefore more unpleasant. A recognition, maybe, or the refusal to recognize something he'd seen. Bit early for recreational madness, Granger, he said. Though I suppose if you're writing in languages that don't exist, that's its own kind of achievement. Hermione didn't look up. It exists, she said pleasantly. You simply don't know it. It's not in any book, he said. There was an edge in it that didn't quite match the casual contempt. I looked. This made Hermione look up. Harry, watching, caught the fractional pause as she recalibrated. Malfoy had looked. That was information. What book? She asked. Several. His jaw tightened. My family's library has texts that your lot don't have access to, pre-founder materials. I've been through every script in them. His eyes moved to the parchment. That script isn't in any of them, because it predates them, Hermione said, and her voice had lost the pleasant quality, not replaced by hostility but by something more level and attentive. Significantly, Malfoy looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and managing none of them gracefully. Where did you find it? I remembered it, she said simply, and picked up her quill. The dismissal was complete, not aggressive. It didn't need to be. Hermione had the gift, when she chose to use it, of making a person feel that the conversation was simply over in the way that a finished meal was over, and that any attempt to continue was a peculiarity on their part. Malfoy stood there for 1 second too long. Then Crabbe jostled him from behind and he moved and was gone, and Harry filed the interaction under interesting and not finished. He looked in his family library, Harry said. I heard. Hermione was writing again, but her pen had the quick, decisive quality of following a fresh thought rather than continuing an existing one. The Malfoy library has pre-founder texts. I knew that they've donated some to the Ministry archive over the years, very high-profile donations designed to establish cultural legitimacy, but I didn't know they had anything with script comparisons. She looked up. He wasn't trying to find what I was writing, he was trying to identify it. He's seen something in those texts that he couldn't identify, and I set off a recognition. He knows something's happening. He sensed something's happening, which means his father will know by the end of the week, Harry said, which means Voldemort might know by the end of the month. She pressed her lips together briefly, not in fear, in calculation. That accelerates things slightly. Harry ate his toast. Across the hall, Malfoy had rejoined the Slytherin table and was apparently eating normally, talking to Not, performing ordinary morning. But Harry had spent enough years watching Malfoy to read the set of his shoulders, and what they were doing right now was the physical vocabulary of someone whose mind was elsewhere and working hard. We need to practice today, Harry said, properly, not just the passive stuff, deliberately. I need to know what I can do. Hermione considered this. The room of requirement, she said. After dinner, I've been writing up a framework from the archive materials, a way to approach the old workings deliberately rather than waiting for them to surface on their own. She paused. It's not like learning a spell, Harry. There's no incantation to practice. The structure is, it's like the difference between reciting a sentence from memory and actually speaking a language. The technique is in the thinking, not in the doing. I understand, Harry said. She looked at him. I know you do, she said. That's the strange part. The room of requirement that evening had provided them with a stone-floored practice space with very high ceilings, higher than the room should have been able to produce given its position in the castle, which was itself interesting, and bare walls and good light from a source Harry couldn't identify. No magical artifacts, no training dummies, nothing but space, which was what they'd needed. Hermione spent the first 15 minutes talking, not explaining theory to him the way she sometimes did, with the implicit pedagogy of someone teaching a slower student, more like talking through something they both mostly knew, using the spoken word to crystallize an order, thinking aloud but with him as an equal participant rather than an audience. The old workings aren't structured on the incantation plus intent model, she said, pacing slightly, arms folded, her voice in its working register. Modern spellwork is basically you specify the effect through the incantation, which packages the intent in a pre-agreed form and the wand channels and amplifies. It works reliably, it's teachable, it has predictable limits, but the underlying theory it's built on is a simplified extraction from something more fundamental. The intent is the working, Harry said. Closer to the architecture is the working. Intent is necessary but not sufficient. Modern spells use the incantation to short-circuit the architectural step. You don't need to understand the structure because the incantation provides it pre-built, like using a calculator versus understanding the mathematics. She stopped pacing. What we're doing is the mathematics, no calculator. And wands are amplifiers, they don't add capability, they refine it. For what we're working with, a wand it's like using a megaphone to have a conversation with someone standing in front of you. It's not necessary. It might actually be slightly limiting because it interposes itself between the working and the worker. She paused. I've been doing most of my tests wandless. The control is actually better. Harry thought about Demelza on the Quidditch pitch, the absolute immediate certainty of the air thickening to catch her. Wand, no incantation, barely a conscious decision. Show me something, he said. Hermione held out one hand, palm upward, and didn't speak or gesture. The air above her palm developed a small coherent geometry, not visible in the way a Lumos light was visible, but present in the way you could see a heat shimmer above hot stone, a distortion that had shape and intention. It held for a moment, then she released it. That's a pressure architecture, she said. I can expand it to room scale. I haven't tried anything larger. She looked at him. Now you. Harry stood still for a moment. He wasn't nervous. He'd noticed the complete absence of performance anxiety in anything related to the old magic, which was interesting in contrast to the low-grade dread he'd always felt around complex conventional spellwork. This felt like the opposite of performing, like settling. He thought about the sphere of light in his memory. Not with effort, just let the thought in, the way you let a memory in when you wanted to recall a face. The light came, not summoned, arrived, in his upturned palm, steady and warm and the color of something between gold and white, and it breathed in out with a rhythm that matched his own. No wand, no words. He looked at it and felt nothing so much as recognition, the particular satisfaction of a thing being exactly what it should be. Hermione was very still. That's the light from your memory, she said. Yes, Harry. She walked closer, examining it with her head tilted. That's not a conjured flame, that's not Lumos. The magical signature is. She reached toward it carefully and stopped just short of touching it, and Harry could see her reading it the way she read text, processing. It's a fundamental working, not a spell at all. It's a manifestation of base magical architecture, like seeing someone's magic itself, not a product of it. It's always been there, Harry said, which was true in the way that his heartbeat had always been there. He just hadn't been aware of it. I think it's been there since I was born. He paused. Since I was whatever I was before. Hermione watched the light breathe for a moment, then she did the same as he had, stood still, let something in, stopped trying. A pattern appeared in the air above her free hand. It was the binding architecture from her drawing, or the beginning of it, the geometric progressions, arcs of light that hung without dissipating, self-reinforcing, each line supporting and extending the ones around it. It grew without visible effort, a few inches, then a foot, then 3 feet of working that filled the air with a clean, complex structure that was clearly about to become something much larger. She stopped it. I can feel where it goes, she said, slightly breathless, not from exertion but from the effort of containment. If I let it develop fully, it would, she paused. It would interact with the castle's foundations. I can feel the resonance. Hogwarts wants to pick it up. Don't do that in here, Harry said mildly. She released the working and it dissolved instantly and cleanly. She exhaled. No, not yet. She rubbed her hands together, the gesture of someone returning to their ordinary scale. But Harry, she looked at him, and there was something in her face that was close to what she'd looked like reading the scroll for the first time. We're not going to be limited to what we've recovered yet. The architecture is in us. It doesn't need to be fully remembered to be accessed. It just needs to be asked, Harry said. Yes, simply to be asked. They practiced for 3 hours. By the end of it, Harry had moved from the sphere of light to something more deliberately shaped. He could form pressure architectures, direct them with precision, stack them in ways that created effects well beyond what a standard charm would produce. He destroyed a practice target Hermione conjured from one end of the room with a working that did not require him to raise his arm, speak, or do anything external that anyone watching would have connected to magic. He simply decided the target should come apart at its structural seams, and it did, with a clean inevitability that was very different from the explosive drama of a conventional attack spell. Hermione was, if anything, ahead of him. She had the theory deep in her bones. Seraphil had always been the architect, Calian the practitioner who turned architectural into actual. The division of skill was reasserting itself in their practice, not as a hierarchy but as a complementarity. She designed and he deployed, and the working between them was faster and more powerful than either was alone. Neither of them said this explicitly. They didn't need to. They were also, by the third hour, speaking to each other in fragments of the old language, not fluently, not in full sentences, but in the shorthand of it, the specific compressed terms that had no modern equivalent. It happened gradually enough that when Harry noticed it, he'd already been doing it for 20 minutes. He stopped. I know, Hermione said. Is that the resonance? She was quiet for a moment. It's part of it, she said. The language is coming back because we're using the workings, and the workings are in the language. She met his eyes across the practice space. I think this is the window closing, the recall accelerating. Harry thought about the scroll's warning, visible and not yet invulnerable. The window, the people who would sense the disturbance before the anchors understood what they were. Malfoy already saw it, he said. Yes. Then we don't wait. If the window closes when we're fully present to each other, if it's about concealment between the anchors. Harry, she said with a quality of voice that he recognized as her version of asking for time. I'm not pressuring, he said immediately. I just mean if the alternative is the window staying open while Voldemort figures out what's happening. I know what you mean. She folded her arms, not defensively. More like holding herself together while she thought. It's not a question of wanting to, she started again. Calian and Seraphil, their relationship, what we're talking about completing isn't just a magical process, Harry, it's what was between them, between us, and I need another pause. I need to know what I'm choosing from my own present, not just what was already decided in a past life. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. Is it strange to you? She asked that they were. No, he said, not strange. He thought about it honestly, which was something he was doing more of lately, the old magic apparently having a side effect of making self-deception uncomfortable. I think on some level it's been not strange for longer than this week. Hermione looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was her version of needing a second. We should sleep, she said. We should, he agreed. Walking back through the corridors, neither of them spoke much, and the silence was the kind that had a shape to it, that was made of something rather than merely being the absence of words. The confrontation with Draco Malfoy happened on a Saturday, which felt like bad scheduling. Harry had been in the Charms corridor after a morning practice session, individual work this time. Hermione was in the library when he turned a corner and found Malfoy waiting for him. Not ambush waiting, not positioned for a fight. Standing in the corridor with two of his usual escort conspicuously absent and an expression that was working very hard at being nothing. Potter, he said. Malfoy, Harry said, and stopped walking. Alone, Malfoy said with a slight quality of surprise. I'm allowed to be alone, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him for a moment. What's happening to you, he said. And the remarkable thing about it was that it was not rhetorical, and it was not a threat, and it was not the prelude to anything. It was a genuine question, asked with the slightly strained quality of someone who normally operated through indirection and was finding that unavailable. Could you be more specific? Harry said. I saw what you did at Quidditch practice. Malfoy's jaw was set. Demelza Robbins, no one 30 feet of air and you caught her without moving your feet. He paused. I've seen exceptional cushioning charms, I've seen good summoning work, that wasn't either. Wind, Harry said. Don't, Malfoy said with sudden sharpness. Don't patronize me, I'm not an idiot, and whatever is happening I want to. He stopped himself, recalibrated. When he continued, his voice was more controlled, which made it harder to read rather than easier. I've been hearing things from my father about the Dark Lord's current focus. There's something that's been picked up in the readings his people use, a pattern that doesn't match anything in their catalogues. He looked directly at Harry. Taken a personal interest in it. Harry kept his face still and his voice even. That's interesting, he said. It's more than interesting. The Dark Lord he's not strategic about things that interest him, he's obsessive. Once something is in his focus, everyone around it becomes a liability if they're not useful. Malfoy's voice had the controlled flatness of someone reporting a flood from a very small boat. I was told to observe, report anything unusual about you and Granger. He held Harry's gaze. I'm telling you instead, which I would appreciate you not taking as a gesture of friendship because it isn't. Harry looked at him. Then what is it? Self-preservation, Malfoy said without embarrassment. Whatever you two are becoming, I'd rather be somewhere else when the collision happens. And since the collision apparently involves the Dark Lord's full attention on a phenomenon he doesn't understand, I need you to understand that I am actively choosing not to be in the path of it. By telling me you were supposed to be watching me, Harry said, by making myself useless as a spy before the role becomes irreversible. He said it with a bitter precision. I can't leave his service, but I can be a bad spy. Harry thought about this for a moment. Thought about Malfoy at breakfast, the genuine puzzlement and recognition in his face over Hermione's script. Thought about a young man who'd been handed a role and a side before he was old enough to understand what either meant. The readings his people took, Harry said. The pattern that doesn't match their catalogues. Can you find out specifically what they found? Malfoy's eyes sharpened. That's all you want? For now, yes. A pause. I can probably find out. He straightened, reinserting the usual distance into his bearing, the protective geometry of a Malfoy in a corridor. Potter, whatever you're doing, be faster than him. That's the only advice I have that matters." He walked away. Harry watched him go. He stood in the empty corridor for a moment, then said quietly in the old language, using 3 words that he hadn't had in him an hour ago and now did the equivalent of understood, moving. Words felt right in his mouth like nothing had before. He told Hermione in the library. She listened, asked 3 precise questions about Malfoy's phrasing and demeanor, and then went quiet in the way she did when she was rebuilding a model. "Voldemort's people have detection methods for non-standard magical signatures," she said. "That makes sense. He's always been looking for edges, methods outside normal parameters. Whatever they use, it picked us up. He doesn't know what it is yet. Which is the only advantage we have right now." She looked at the window, the October grounds grey and bright simultaneously. "Harry, I want to go back to the archive today. Now I need the 3rd scroll. It's daylight. Filch is on the east side on Saturday afternoons. I've tracked the pattern for 3 years." She was already packing her bag with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for permission to act. "Dumbledore takes his Saturday constitutional to the greenhouses at 2. The library will have Ravenclaws in the main section, but they never go to the restricted side on Saturdays because Madame Pince is more alert on weekdays." She paused. "I know this sounds like I've been planning unsanctioned library incursions for some time. I wasn't going to say anything." 3 years, she confirmed without apology. "Let's go." They went. Under the cloak in the less-used corridors, moving with the quick, certain economy of 2 people who had spent a week building up the specific skill of moving through Hogwarts unobserved. Harry had found in the past week that his senses had sharpened in ways he didn't fully have names for. He could feel the difference in the air of a corridor with someone around a corner before he reached it, could sense the occupied or empty quality of rooms before opening doors. He mentioned this to Hermione without leading it, and she said, without looking up from navigating, "Calian worked in environments where being detected meant," she paused, "bad outcomes. Survival sense in a past body apparently transfers." "Useful," Harry said, "extremely." The archive opened for them with the same quiet certainty as before, his hand on the wall, the stone stepping aside. Inside, the disc glowed its ambient glow, and the scrolls waited on their shelves, and the preserved cool held everything exactly as they'd left it. Hermione went directly to the 3rd scroll and began reading. Harry took down the books he'd identified before and opened the most complex of them, and this time found he could read more of it than before, not fluently, but in the way you could read a page in a language you were actively recalling, picking up threads, losing them, finding them again further on. The book was a technical manual. That was the closest English description, a working guide to the binding architecture, not theory but process, step by step described in that precise compressed language, with diagrams that his hands moved over with the same proprioceptive recognition as before. He spent an hour on 30 pages and came away with 3 things he hadn't known that morning. The first was that the disc was a keystone. The binding architecture, when completed, required a keystone to anchor it, a central node that held the geometry of the whole working in a stable state. Without the keystone, the architecture was functional but not permanent. The second was that the keystone needed to be returned to a specific point in Hogwarts Foundations, a location described with enough geometric precision that Harry could extrapolate its rough position in the current building, and it was, as best he could determine, somewhere in the lowest levels, below the dungeons, in the part of the castle that appeared on no map he'd ever seen. The third was the description of what the completed working would do. He read it 3 times to be sure he was understanding the compressed language correctly. Then he looked up. "Hermione," he said, "what does sanctum aperture translate to?" She didn't look up from her own scroll. "Literally, opening of the sanctuary, or the sanctuary becoming open." "Why?" "Because the book says that the completed working produces a sanctum aperture of the 3rd order, and the 3rd order is defined as," he found the relevant passage, "as accessible without condition to any with the capacity." Capacity is the word it uses. This made her look up. He watched her process it. "Any witch or wizard," she said. "Any witch or wizard, regardless of training, regardless of bloodline, regardless of what school they attended or whether they attended any school." He set the book down. "The completed working opens access to all of it. The full foundational architecture makes it available, the way reading makes language available." Hermione was very still. "Calian and Seraphal's original project," she said, "the thing the 30 stopped them from completing. The democratization." She sat back. Something was moving across her face that was too large and too complex to name. "We didn't just build a repository. We were going to make the old knowledge universally accessible, hardwire it into the magical world in a form that couldn't be controlled or restricted. And if we complete it now in the middle of a war where Voldemort's entire philosophy is built on blood supremacy and the restriction of magic to those he deems worthy, it would make his foundational premise obsolete," Harry said. "It would make it obviously, demonstrably false." She looked at him, "Not by arguing with him. By making every witch and wizard who currently can't access the full depth of their own magic simply able to. Just able. Because the architecture would be there, open and," she stopped. "Harry, the people who can't develop past certain levels because their training was limited. The first-generation witches and wizards who struggle because no one in their family could teach them the fundamentals. Every person the current system underserves because the system was built on restriction. All of them, Harry said. The archive room was quiet around them. The disc glowed its steady, patient glow. This is why, Hermione said very quietly. This is why we came back now, not just because of Voldemort. Anyone with enough conventional power could fight Voldemort. We came back because she stopped again. There were things her voice was doing that she was visibly managing. We came back to finish what we started. Harry looked at the disc, thought about the book's description of the keystone, the specific point in the foundations, the completed working, thought about what it would mean not as an abstraction but as a practical reality, thought about the first-generation students he'd known over 6 years at Hogwarts, the ones who'd arrived with all the talent in the world and a structural deficit that no amount of studying had fully bridged. Thought about Neville Longbottom, told for years that he was limited, discovering in his 5th year that he'd been lied to about his own capacity. Thought about that multiplied by every person in the magical world who'd been managed into smallness. He thought about Voldemort, whose entire project of domination required that some people be inherently worth more than others. He thought about completing the working that would make that argument impossible. Right, Harry said. Then let's get faster. They were sealing the archive when they heard it, not footsteps exactly, but the specific quality of a changed air in the restricted section. Someone with a wand, actively using it, running detection charms. Harry looked at Hermione. She looked at him. The wall had already resealed behind them. They moved to the restricted section's edge and Harry held the cloak open and they both went under it, moving with the silence they'd been practicing, and found a gap between 2 large shelves where they could be still. Professor Crane was moving through the restricted section with a slim wand and a systematic approach, running a pale blue detection charm over the shelves and the floor in rows. He wasn't browsing. He was searching for something specific, or for evidence of something specific. The detection charm had the quality of a forensic tool rather than a research one. He reached the back wall, ran the charm over it. The charm showed nothing. Of course, the archive's concealment was several thousand years older than any detection system in current use, and it hadn't been disturbed in any way that modern magic would register. Crane stared at the wall for a long moment, then ran the charm twice more with increasing precision. Nothing. He lowered his wand. His expression, visible in the residual glow of the charm, was the controlled frustration of a man who was looking for something he'd been told was there and couldn't find it. Dumbledore had told him to look, Harry thought. This was the response to Tuesday's staff reports, not Dumbledore himself, Dumbledore sending someone. Someone new enough to the school to approach this cleanly without his own history complicating it. Crane was not, Harry decided, a threat in any direct sense. He was an instrument being used by a person who was uncertain what he was looking for but knew he was looking. That was, if anything, more complicated. After 4 minutes, Crane left the restricted section, reset the detection charms at its perimeter as they had been, and walked toward the library's main exit with the unhurried pace of someone who intended to look unhurried. Harry and Hermione stayed under the cloak for another 3 minutes after the library door closed. Dumbledore is escalating, Hermione said, barely audible. Slowly, Harry said. He still doesn't know what he's looking for. Give him 2 more weeks, she said, which was an answer to the question neither of them had asked yet, which was, how long do we have? They left the library, the cloak pulled close, and walked back through the afternoon castle, and neither of them was afraid exactly, but both of them had the feeling of a clock that had just ticked a number louder than the ones before it. Back in the common room, they found Luna Lovegood sitting in one of the armchairs by the fire, which was unusual enough to stop Harry dead in the portrait hole. Luna, being a Ravenclaw, had no business being in the Gryffindor common room at all, and was apparently there by some arrangement with the portrait that no one had bothered to document. She looked up from whatever she was reading, a magazine held sideways, the way Luna often read things as though the orientation of text was negotiable, and smiled at them with the particular quality of warmth she reserved for people she decided were fundamentally good. I've been waiting, she said pleasantly. How did you get in? Hermione asked. I asked nicely. She set the magazine down. I wanted to tell you you've been moving differently, both of you, for about 10 days now. She said it with the simple directness she used for factual observations about things other people pretended not to notice. It started the same day the castle started humming. Harry and Hermione exchanged a look. The castle is humming, Hermione said. Very deep, Luna said. Below hearing, really, you feel it more than you hear it. I noticed it in the foundations when I was in the lower corridors. She looked at Harry with her wide, clear gaze. It feels like something waiting to be completed, like a song where someone stopped before the last line. Harry looked at her. Luna, he said, what do you know about the foundations of this castle, below the dungeons? She tilted her head. I know there's something down there that's older than the school and older than whatever was here before the school. She considered. I've been down to the lowest accessible level twice. You can feel it through the floor. Something very settled and very patient and very much like a person who's been asleep for a long time and is about to wake up. She paused. Is it you? Are you waking it up? The fire crackled. The common room was warm and empty except for the 3 of them. We're trying to, Harry said. Luna nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. I thought so, she said. You should know that Professor Crane has been asking students questions, casually in classes after class, about whether they've noticed anything unusual about Harry or Hermione. She looked between them. Most people said no, some people said yes, and then looked confused about whether they were supposed to say yes. Ginny said something that I don't think Professor Crane found useful. What did Ginny say? Harry asked. She said you'd always been unusual and she didn't see what was different about lately. Luna smiled, which isn't entirely true, but it's the right kind of not true. She picked up her magazine again. I'll help if you need it. I know things about the lower castle levels, and I can go places people don't follow because they find me difficult to track. Luna, Hermione said, and her voice had a warmth in it that was slightly surprised by itself. Thank you, of course. She turned a page of the magazine. You know, Nargle activity in the lower castle has been significantly elevated for weeks. Everyone dismisses Nargles, but they're excellent indicators of magical disturbance at a fundamental level. They were very active the morning before the last Quidditch World Cup, and the night before the Triwizard Tournament began. She looked up over the magazine's edge, and every day for the last 10 days, the fire settled in the grate. The castle breathed around them, and in its deepest self, below the dungeons and the flagstones and the pre-founder geometry of a foundation laid by patient hands for exactly this purpose, something settled into a frequency that the castle's stones had been designed to receive, and the hum that Luna had described, which had been barely present since the first night in the archive, grew 1 degree louder. Harry and Hermione both felt it through the soles of their feet, at exactly the same moment, and looked at each other with an expression that was equal parts recognition and readiness, and something else that neither of them was naming yet. Outside, a crow landed on the windowsill, considered the warm fire through the glass, and flew away. The October dark was gathering at the edges of the grounds, and Draco Malfoy was in his dormitory writing a letter he'd already rewritten twice, and Dumbledore was in his office with a cup of tea that was still warm this time, reading Crane's report, and Tom Riddle's resurrected body was in a house in the Midlands where a fire burned in a dark room, and his most trusted lieutenants spoke quietly about a pattern in the magical readings that their lord had found intensely, personally interesting. The clock ticked, and in the deepest level of the castle the patient hum continued, waiting for the last line of the song. Chapter 4, Dumbledore's Move. The summons came on a Monday. A small folded note delivered by one of Hogwarts' internal owls during breakfast. Harry recognized Dumbledore's handwriting before he'd fully unfolded it, the distinctive forward-leaning script that always managed to look both warm and deliberate, as though each letter had been placed with the awareness that it would be read carefully. Harry, please come to my office this evening at 7. There is something I'd like to discuss with you. The password is lemon sorbet. AD. He read it twice, folded it. Ate his egg. Across the table, Hermione was watching him with the stillness she used when she was waiting for information she'd already half predicted. He slid the note across without comment. She read it, slid it back, and returned to her breakfast with the expression of someone who had just had a moderately significant chess move confirmed. Remember what I said about the tone, she said, keeping her voice under the general breakfast noise. He'll open with genuine warmth. He'll use your name frequently. At some point he'll say something that's technically a question but is actually an invitation to self-report, and the phrasing will be generous enough that reporting honestly will feel like the right thing to do. I know, Harry said. I know you know. I'm saying it so we've said it out loud. She poured herself more tea. He genuinely cares about you. That's what makes it complicated. He's not manipulating you cynically, he's managing you carefully, which is different, and the distinction matters because it means the warmth is real and you have to account for it. And if he asks me directly what's happening, she thought about this. Tell him something true that isn't the whole truth. You've been experiencing unusual magical development, you're monitoring it, you don't yet know the full scope. She met his eyes, all of which is accurate. Right, Harry said. And Harry, watch his hands. He uses them deliberately when he's leading a conversation somewhere specific. If he's gesturing toward the pensive, he's already decided you need to see something. Harry looked at her for a moment. When did you develop this much intelligence on Dumbledore's conversational techniques? She set her cup down. I've been paying attention for 6 years, she said simply. The difference is that now I know why it mattered that I was paying attention. The day moved with the ordinary texture of a school Monday, which Harry was beginning to find deeply strange. The mundanity of lessons, of homework, of Quidditch practice scheduling discussions, and the specific minor social frictions of 6 years in the same house, all of it continuing with perfect indifference to the fact that everything had changed. Flitwick praised his charm's work. McGonagall was brisk and precise. Potions with Slughorn was fragrant and complex, and Harry produced a shrinking solution of unusual quality by instinct, reaching for the fundamental magical architecture beneath the recipe rather than following the recipe. And Slughorn told the class that here was the mark of a true potioneer, and Harry thought, that is not what this is. By the time 7 o'clock arrived, he was calm in the way that had become his default state over the past 2 weeks, not the performed calm of someone suppressing anxiety, but the genuine calm of someone whose interior landscape had expanded enough that small concerns had proportionally smaller weight. The gargle stepped aside before he gave the password. He filed this information and went upstairs. Dumbledore's office was the same as always and never the same twice. The accumulated significance of it arranged itself differently depending on where you were in your life when you entered it. The objects catching different light, the portrait subjects seeming to watch from different angles. Tonight Harry noticed the portraits more than usual. The previous headmasters and headmistresses in their frames, some dozing, some watching. The ones who were watching him had an attention about it that felt less like casual observation and more like assessment. He wondered briefly if any of them recognized something in him that their painted eyes could see. Harry. Dumbledore came around from behind his desk with the warmth that Hermione had predicted, genuine, unhurried, the warmth of a man who was genuinely pleased to see him and was also doing 4 other things simultaneously in the landscape of his mind. Please sit, tea. Thank you, Harry said and sat and accepted the cup. Fawkes made a soft sound from the perch. Harry looked at the phoenix and Fawkes looked back with the particular deep quality of phoenix attention, which wasn't like bird attention at all, and had always made Harry feel slightly seen through in a way that was oddly comfortable. How is your year going so far? Dumbledore settled into his own chair with the ease of someone who had sat in that chair for 40 years and had reached a cellular-level understanding of its angles. You seem well. I am, sir. Harry drank his tea. Better than last year. I'm very glad to hear it. He said it simply and meant it, which was the thing about Dumbledore that made everything else complicated. The transition from 5th to 6th year is often an important one. The coursework becomes, well, you know. But beyond the academic, there is frequently a change in how students relate to their own magical capacity, a kind of settling. He paused, and the pause was perfectly timed. Have you experienced anything of that sort? There it was. The opening question framed generously the technical question that was an invitation. Harry heard Hermione's voice in his head, tell him something true that isn't the whole truth, and also heard something else, some older voice beneath it, the voice that had said across a fire in another life, don't mistake your concern for authority over what we're doing. He let the older voice be still for now. That tone was for a different conversation. Definitely, Harry said honestly. My control has been better. Things that required effort last year feel more natural. Looked at Dumbledore with the open, thoughtful expression of a student sharing a genuine observation. Like the gap between knowing something and knowing something, between having the technique and actually having integrated it. Dumbledore nodded slowly, his blue eyes steady and very bright. Harry watched the eyes carefully. They were doing their deep, reading thing, moving over Harry's face with an attention that was thorough enough to be uncomfortable if you were less certain of your own ground than Harry currently was. That's very well put, Dumbledore said. And Hermione, how is she finding 6th year? Not unexpected. But the shift was slightly quick, which itself was information. Dumbledore didn't move subjects quickly unless the subject he was moving to was the one he'd actually wanted to be on. Thriving, Harry said. She's always thrived academically, but she seems more settled, like you said, like things are clicking. Yes, Dumbledore turned his cup in his hands. Harry, I'd like to show you something in the pensive, a memory I've been looking at recently that I think it provides context for things we'll be discussing over the coming months. He rose, unhurried, moving toward the silver basin on its stand, and there it was. Hermione had said, if he's gesturing toward the pensive, he's already decided you need to see something. But Harry looked at the gesture, at the direction of it, and understood something additional. Dumbledore was going to the pensive because the pensive was the most controlled form of information sharing. You saw what he showed you. You couldn't ask follow-up questions to a memory you received. What memory? Harry asked, not aggressively, with the mild curiosity of a student who liked to know what he was about to see. Dumbledore paused almost imperceptibly. Most people wouldn't have asked. Most people shown the pensive and told that there was something useful in it, went to look at what they were given. It's a memory from a colleague of mine, Dumbledore said, the pause absorbed back into his warmth, a witch who devoted her life to the study of pre-founder magical history. She found something that I've been attempting to understand for some years, references to a period of magical practice that predates anything we've formally documented. His voice was measured, each word placed. Given your particular situation, I thought it might be illuminating. Your particular situation. There it was, clean and direct, dressed in scholarly framing. He knew. Not everything, Harry was confident of that, but enough to know that the conversation he was having with Harry was about the same thing that he and Hermione were navigating. He was telling Harry that he knew, and the knowing was presented as a gift, and the gift was an opening for Harry to say more. Harry looked at Dumbledore, the whole of him, the white beard and the half-moon spectacles and the eyes that were the blue of deep water and the hands that turned the teacup and the robes that were slightly rumpled at the right shoulder the way they always were, and felt for the first time in 6 years of knowing this man something very close to pity, not contempt, pity specifically, which was harder and more respectful and more painful than contempt, because Dumbledore was doing his absolute best. That was the truth of him, the most fundamental thing about him, and it was also the source of the problem. He was doing his absolute best from within a framework that assumed he was the most important person in the room, not from arrogance, from a lifetime of evidence. He had been the most important person in most rooms for most of his life, and he had used that position to do genuinely important work, and the framework had calcified around him like amber around an insect, preserving everything exactly as it was. Harry thought about the 30, about the man by the fire who wasn't malicious, just positioned, about political sophistication expressed as concern. "I'd like to see it," Harry said. The pensive memory was, as he'd expected, curated. A scholar's study, a woman he didn't recognize, elderly, bent over a desk covered in texts, speaking in the rapid, compressed way of someone dictating for a record. She described discovering textual fragments in what she called a presyntactic script, a notation system that predated all known proto-magical languages, found in the foundations of several European magical sites including, she noted with particular emphasis, Hogwarts. She had been unable to translate them. She had been unable to find anyone who could. She had, however, been able to determine their approximate age, several thousand years beyond the founder period, and to note that the sites where they appeared were not random but followed a geometric pattern when mapped. She laid the map on the desk. Harry looked at it from inside the memory. The pattern was the binding architecture. He recognized it immediately and completely, the same structure Hermione had drawn on her first night, the same geometry he'd been practicing in the Room of Requirement, here rendered in the scale of geography in the positions of magical sites across Britain and continental Europe. The sites were nodes in the working. Hogwarts was the keystone position. He kept his face still and looked with the appropriate expression of an interested student seeing an unfamiliar historical document. They came back out of the pensive. Dumbledore watched him. "Remarkable," Harry said, settling back into his chair. "She never identified the script." "Never," Dumbledore said. And then, after a careful pause, "Have you seen anything like it? In your reading, perhaps?" There was the real question, finally stripped of its preliminary layers. "Have you seen it? Do you know what it is not? Can you read it?" Because Dumbledore wasn't certain enough yet to ask those questions directly, and asking them would reveal how much he suspected, and revealing that would change the dynamic of the conversation in ways he couldn't yet control. Harry met his eyes. "It's an interesting geometric pattern," he said. "I'd have to think about whether I've come across anything similar." Another almost imperceptible pause. "Of course," Dumbledore said warmly, "there's no rush. It's a puzzle I've been sitting with for quite some time. A few more days makes no difference." They talked for another 40 minutes about Voldemort, about the war's current shape, about Harry's occlumency practice, which Harry reported as improved, which was more than true. Dumbledore was thorough and wise and genuinely helpful on the strategic questions, the intelligence they had about Voldemort's movements, the likely timeline of his next major action. Harry listened and contributed and stored everything carefully because all of it was real and useful regardless of the other things Dumbledore was simultaneously doing. When he left, Dumbledore walked him to the door and at the door said, "Harry, I want you to know that whatever you are experiencing, whatever changes you may be noticing in yourself, you can come to me, at any time, without preparation or explanation." Harry looked at him. "Thank you, sir," he said, and meant it, and knew that Dumbledore could hear that he meant it. He went down the stairs and through the corridor and was well away before he let himself think about the map in the memory, the binding architecture in geographical scale, Hogwarts at the center, and the fact that Dumbledore had the map and had been sitting with it for some time and had, almost certainly, already begun to understand what the keystone position meant. Hermione was in the common room. She'd moved her entire current research operation to the most isolated table in the corner, surrounded by a casual arrangement of books that to any passing student looked like standard academic overdrive, but was in fact a subtle perimeter, books placed to obstruct sightlines, the table positioned so that the stone wall was at her back and she could see the portrait hole. She'd been here for 3 years and had apparently been operating a low-grade intelligence procedure the entire time. Harry sat across from her and gave her the full debrief in a quiet voice while she listened and made 2 notes. When he finished with the map, she set her quill down. "He has the geographical correspondence," she said. "Yes, his scholar found it but couldn't interpret it. But Dumbledore is better at synthesis than any scholar," she said. "He'll connect the individual findings eventually. The script in the foundations, the geographic pattern, the changes in us, he'll build the model." She pressed her fingers to her lips briefly. "How long do you think he has? At the pace he's moving, 2 weeks, maybe less." Harry paused. "He's not going to try to stop us, I don't think. What's he going to try to do? Manage the situation." He thought about the office, the warmth, the pensive. "He's going to try to position himself as the authority on what's happening and present us with a framework for understanding it that keeps him at the center. Not because he's malicious, because he can't conceive of a situation he's not at the center of. It's not ego exactly, it's structural. He's been the load-bearing wall for so long that he can't imagine the building standing without him." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "That was very well put," she said in an echo of Dumbledore that was probably not entirely accidental. Harry almost smiled. "The other thing," he said, "the map. If he's been studying the pattern and he knows Hogwarts is the keystone site, he may already be monitoring the foundations." This landed. He could see it land in the slight shift of her focus. "If there are detection charms on the sub-foundation levels," she said carefully, "then going down there to return the disc becomes complicated." "Complicated or impossible," she said. Then, "No, not impossible. We'd need to understand the detection methods first." She was already thinking ahead, he could see it in the speed of her eyes. Luna said she'd been to the lowest accessible level twice. If there are pre-existing detection charms on the sub-levels, they'd have triggered on her visits, but Dumbledore didn't react to her visits, or if he did, he filed it under normal Luna Lovegood eccentricity. She paused. I'll talk to Luna tomorrow. There's also Malfoy, Harry said. He was going to find out what specifically Voldemort's readings detected. If we know the signature they picked up, we can work out how much they know about the current state of the recall. Have you heard from him? Not yet. Hermione nodded, made a note. Outside the common room windows, the October night was fully present, deep dark, the grounds invisible, the lake a hypothetical. The fire had burned down to a steady working level, and the common room had thinned as the evening advanced, students drifting upstairs in ones and twos until only a few remained, too absorbed in homework to notice two people conducting a quiet strategic review in the corner. How are you with the return of the language? Hermione asked. It was a shift in register from operational to something else. Fast, Harry said. Faster than the other things. I woke up this morning and translated 3 lines of the book before I'd fully registered that I was doing it. Same. She folded her arms, looking at the table. I've started dreaming in it, not dreaming about memories, dreaming in the language, as though it's re-establishing itself as my first language and English is becoming the second. Is that a problem? No, she said, and then, I don't think so. It feels like a correction, like something being set right that was off. She paused, though I am slightly concerned about what happens if I accidentally speak it in class. You already did that once. Yes, and I'd rather not repeat it on a larger scale. She gave him the dry look she reserved for practical concerns that were also genuinely funny. Could you imagine full monologue in ancient pre-syntactic magical language in the middle of McGonagall's transfiguration class? McGonagall would find a category for it within about 10 seconds, Harry said. She's unflappable. She's the most unflappable person I've ever met, Hermione agreed. But even she has limits. The fire settled. In the brief quiet, they both sat with the shape of things as they currently stood. The acceleration of the recall, Dumbledore building his model, Voldemort's attention sharpened on an anomaly his instruments had detected, Malfoy navigating his impossible position with what appeared to be a private decision to be a bad asset, Luna in her Ravenclaw tower with her magazines and her nargles and her certainty about the castle's hum. The disc, Harry said. I keep thinking about it. I know. I do too, not strategically, just I think about it, the warmth of it, and he stopped, aware he was about to say something that had been sitting at the edge of his awareness for days. I keep feeling like it's waiting, like it's patient, but it's not passive, like it knows. Hermione looked at him steadily. Keystones aren't passive objects, she said. In the architecture, they're the point where the working becomes coherent. They're inherently relational. They need the geometry around them to mean anything, and the geometry needs them to hold. She paused. If it's been in that archive for thousands of years and it's warming to your touch, then yes, in a meaningful sense, it knows you're back. Harry sat with that. I'm going to go down to the archive tomorrow night, Hermione said. The remaining scrolls, there's information there I need about the sub-foundation levels, the approach to the keystone point. If we're going to do this before Dumbledore has the full picture, we go soon, Harry said. Yes. She began packing her research materials with the deliberate efficiency that meant she was also thinking about 3 other things. Harry, one more thing. She didn't look at him immediately. The resonance, the window, I've been thinking about what the scroll said, no concealment between the anchors. She did look at him then, directly, with the kind of directness she normally reserved for presenting research conclusions. I've been thinking about it practically, not in the larger sense, in the practical sense of what does that mean for what we're doing. Tell me what you think it means, Harry said carefully. I think it means we can't go into the final working with anything unresolved between us, she said, emotionally. The architecture requires, the analogy the scroll uses is 2 load-bearing columns. They have to be plumb, they have to be true. If one is carrying something it hasn't set down, the whole structure is compromised. She was speaking with clinical precision now, which was its own form of self-protection and also just how she processed things that mattered. So I'm telling you that I've been thinking about what it means. For me, present tense me, not serifal. And I don't have a conclusion yet, but I wanted you to know I was thinking about it. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Okay, yeah, I've been thinking about it too. He said it simply, without performance. Same way, present tense, not historical. A pause, also no conclusion, but there's a thing that happens when we're working together. The workings are stronger, the architecture is faster. I can feel it, and I think you can too. I can, she said. That's not the conclusion either, he said, but it's the same direction. She held his gaze for a moment, and what was in her face was a little like the moment in the archive when the room had lit up, not dramatic, not sudden, but illuminating. Right, she said. Good night, Harry. Night, Hermione. Draco Malfoy found Harry the following afternoon between herbology and dinner, in the side corridor he'd apparently identified as their exchange point, with the posture of someone who had decided something difficult and was committed to it. The readings, he said without preamble. My father sent me a letter. He thinks he's discussing pest management in the gardens. He handed Harry a folded piece of parchment with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up in a household where messages were always layered. The coded section starts at the third paragraph. Harry read it quickly. Malfoy's father, speaking in the agreed family cipher about unusual groundwater activity in the northern garden and an old root system that the groundskeepers hadn't previously mapped, was describing a magical signature of a kind that Voldemort's detectors, adapted dark magic instruments, calibrated to identify non-standard magical activity, had registered as unprecedented. Not unprecedented in scale, unprecedented in type. The frequency didn't match any known spell family, any known core resonance, any documented phenomenon. It was registering, according to Lucius Malfoy's heavily coded language about the color of the underground water, as something structural and very old, currently in a state of activation. The current location of the strongest signature was described as the Northern Garden's deepest tap roots, Hogwarts, the foundations, the disk in its archive warming for 2 weeks. He knows it's here, Harry said. He knows the source is here, he doesn't know what it is. Malfoy's voice was precise. The instruments have been tracking it since it began, the readings have been intensifying. He paused. The Dark Lord has apparently identified the signature as connected to my father's phrasing is the old ways that predate current practice. He's excited. I've never heard my father describe the Dark Lord as excited before. He looked at Harry with something in his face that was bleaker than his usual performances. He's planning to move on it. Timeline. My father doesn't know, soon, within weeks. Harry folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Thank you, he said, and meant it enough that it was clearly not perfunctory. Malfoy held his gaze for one moment with an expression that was very nearly not armored. Don't get killed, he said, which was the most unguarded thing Harry had ever heard him say. Then he walked away, the armor back in place by the time he rounded the corner. Harry stood in the corridor and did the arithmetic. Dumbledore building his model 2 weeks to full understanding. Voldemort with real-time detection of the activation already moving towards soon, within weeks. The window, the archive. The disc and the keystone point in the sub-foundations, and the 5 remaining scrolls Hermione hadn't read, and the resonance that required no concealment, and the completed working that would open the foundational architecture to everyone and make Voldemort's foundational premise obsolete. The timeline had just compressed significantly. He found Hermione in the library and sat across from her and put Malfoy's letter on the table. She read it. Her face moved through 3 stages that Harry had learned to identify: receiving, processing, deciding, and by the end of the letter she was already in stage 3. Tonight, she said, we need all 5 scrolls. I'll do all 5 tonight. She looked at him. What else? The sub-foundation level. We need to go down, not tonight, tomorrow, but we need to go before Dumbledore has the detection charms in place if he hasn't already. Luna, she said immediately. Luna, he nodded. She's been down there, she knows the layout. I'll find her after dinner. She was already reaching for parchment, the rapid transcription kind. Harry, the 5 scrolls, the full technical sequence for the return. If we can complete the reading tonight, we'll have the full plan. And then we're ready, Harry said. She looked at him across the table, and around them the library was doing its ordinary Thursday afternoon thing, students in and out, Madame Pince patrolling with her proprietary attention, the dust doing its suspended dance in the late light. All of it perfectly normal and completely unremarkable, and sitting on top of a situation that was none of those things. Almost ready, she said, and the distinction was gentle and precise. He understood. The 2 load-bearing columns, the thing unresolved. He thought about what he wanted to say, what Caelian would have said, that figure from another life who had been in all the memories, exact and unhurried and entirely certain of his own heart. But he was not only Caelian. He was Harry Potter, who had been told for years that his life was in service of a prophecy, whose experience of love had been largely the loss of people who loved him, who had never quite learned to hold something good without bracing for when it would be taken. That was not Caelian's damage, that was his own. And Hermione was not only Seraphil. She was Hermione Granger, who had been told for years that being clever was enough, who had made herself essential and reliable and structurally important to everyone around her because significance felt safer than vulnerability, who had filed her own interior life under dress later so many times that later had become a very crowded drawer. The past life clarity was available to both of them. The present life work was something else. Almost ready, Harry agreed. That night after midnight in the archive, Hermione read all 5 scrolls. Harry watched her work. She sat cross-legged on the floor with each scroll laid across her legs, her wand light steady above her left shoulder, her lips barely moving as the language moved through her. She didn't pause, she didn't have to reread. The translation was immediate in the way that speech was immediate, the words arriving in English almost simultaneously with her comprehension of the old script. She read for 2 hours. Harry kept watch for the first hour and spent the second examining the books, absorbing diagrams, and occasionally exchanging a low word with her about specific technical points. What the second scroll's description of the sub-foundation approach matched with what the manual said about the disk's insertion point, whether the geometric precision required was absolute or had tolerances, how long the completion working would take once the disk was placed. By the end of the second hour, they had the full sequence. The approach through a specific passage below the 5th dungeon, not on any map, entered via a ward that responded to old language activation. The disc carried by whoever had the deepest resonance with it, Harry, they both knew this without saying, brought to a specific floor point, a geometric intersection that would be apparent once they were in the sub-foundation level. The disc placed, the binding architecture activated by both of them together, the completion working, and then the sanctum aperture, the opening. How long after placement? Harry asked. The working begins immediately and reaches completion in approximately, she considered the translation, the time it takes for the sun to rise. Once it's tied to a natural cycle, it completes at dawn. So we go at night, we place it before dawn, and the working completes as the sun comes up, she said, which is poetic and also, given the scroll's author, almost certainly not accidental. Harry looked at the disc on its shelf. In the archive's ambient glow, it was patient and certain and warm with the heat of something that had been waiting a very long time and was now finally close. We go the night after next, Hermione said. Tonight we sleep, tomorrow we talk to Luna, confirm the approach and prepare. She paused. And tomorrow, she didn't finish the sentence immediately. Harry waited. The thing we said we'd address, she said, steady, direct, the clinical precision mostly absent now, replaced by something more bare. I'd rather address it before we go into this, not after, not contingently. She met his eyes in the wand light, and whatever she'd been holding in the crowded drawer was visible in her face now, in the specific way that things were visible when you finally stopped working so hard to contain them. I don't want to complete this because Kalian and Seraphil did. I want to complete this because we do. The archive was quiet around them, the old scrolls and books breathing in their preservation. Harry looked at her for a long moment with the deliberate, unhurried clarity that was Kalian's gift, and also he was finding his own when he stopped letting his damage apologize for itself. Then let me be clear, he said, present tense. I would want this regardless of the past life architecture. I would want it if we'd never found the archive or the disc or any of it. I'd want it if we were just two people who'd been noticing the same thing for approximately 5 years and filing it in the same drawer. A pause. I think the drawer was always going to open eventually. The recall just opened it on a schedule. Something shifted in her face, something he couldn't name but recognized. 5 years, she said, and the question held something that was almost amusement and was also entirely serious. At least, Harry said. The archive room was warm and cool simultaneously in the way of places that were outside ordinary time, and the disc breathed on its shelf, and outside Hogwarts the October night was deep and cold and indifferent, and whatever Dumbledore was doing in his office, and whatever Voldemort was planning in his dark house, and whatever Malfoy was dreaming in his dormitory, none of it was in the room, just them. Right, Hermione said, and the word had a completely different weight than the last 40 times she'd said it. That's yes, okay. She pressed her lips together briefly. I'm going to need a moment to not be overwhelmed by that. Take your time, Harry said. She took approximately 4 seconds, which for Hermione was an eternity of processing, and then she straightened, and there was a quality in her face that was the most unguarded he'd ever seen her and the most certain simultaneously, which was not a contradiction, it was just her. We should sleep, she said. We should, he agreed. They resealed the archive and walked back through the dark castle under the cloak, and at the portrait hole Hermione paused with one hand on the frame, not looking at him, which was different from how she usually didn't look at him. Harry, she said, tomorrow, he said. She went inside. He followed, and the portrait swung closed behind them, and the fire in the common room had burned all the way down, and the castle breathed around them in the dark, the hum in the foundations 1 degree louder still, steady and patient and getting ready. In the white-bearded office 3 floors up, Dumbledore sat by his window with his hands folded and the geographical map spread on the desk before him, and after a long time of looking at it, he picked up his quill and wrote a name at the center of the keystone position. He stared at what he'd written for a moment, then he wrote a second name beside it. He set the quill down and looked at the names for a very long time. Oh, he said quietly into the dark office to no one in particular. Fawkes made a soft sound that might have been anything, and the portrait slept, and the grounds below held the dark, and the clock on his desk ticked toward a morning that was going to be different from all the mornings before it. Chapter 5. The old war Luna was already awake when Hermione knocked on the Ravenclaw common room door at 7 the next morning. This was not surprising. What was surprising was that she opened the door dressed for the lower castle, practical shoes, her robes pinned at the hem, a small satchel across her body with the expression of someone who had been expecting the knock and had prepared accordingly. I had a feeling you'd come early, she said. We need to talk about the sub-foundation levels, Hermione said. I know. Luna stepped into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind her. I brought a drawing. They found Harry in the great hall with tea and the deliberate calm of someone who had slept well because sleeping badly would have been a waste of time. He looked at Luna's satchel and raised an eyebrow. She knew, Hermione said. Of course she did, he said without particular surprise and moved along the bench. Luna sat and produced the drawing from her satchel, not a rough sketch but a careful architectural rendering, done in pencil with the confident precision of someone who'd spent time with it. The lower castle levels, drawn from memory, annotated with Luna's characteristic blend of technical observation and entirely personal notation. The dungeons were labeled correctly. Below them, a level that didn't appear on any official floor plan, marked with Luna's handwriting as the cold part and where the hum is loudest. Below that, indicated with lighter pencil lines, a further depth that she'd marked with a single word: old. Could only get to the second level, she said, pointing to the cold part. The ward on the passage to the third is it's not a standard ward. It didn't feel hostile, it just didn't respond to me. She looked at Harry. I think it responds to something specific. The old language, Harry said. Probably, Luna agreed, unconcerned. I tried speaking to it politely in English and it didn't react, which makes sense if it predates English. I left it alone. She pointed to her drawing. The passage entrance on the second level here, behind what looks like a natural rock formation in the east corner of the lowest dungeon corridor. It's not a door exactly, it's a threshold that looks like stone. Show me the geometry, Hermione said, leaning over the drawing. Luna pointed to 3 points she'd marked on the second level, positions she'd identified by feel, by the quality of the hum through the floor. Hermione looked at them for 4 seconds and then reached into her bag and produced her own parchment, the binding architecture diagram, and placed it beside Luna's drawing. The 3 points corresponded exactly to nodes in the outer ring of the architecture. The second level is inside the working, Hermione said. These are structural nodes. We're not going through the building to find the keystone point, we're going through the working itself. The working is the building, Harry said. The foundation of the building, yes, she sat back. Which means the ward on the passage to the third level isn't protecting the sub-foundation space from the building, it's protecting it from people who aren't part of the working. She looked at Harry. You'll be able to open it. What about you, he said. I'll be part of the working the moment we both cross the threshold, she said. The phrasing was clinical and also not, and Harry registered both. Luna looked between them with her serene, reading gaze. You're going tonight, she said. Yes, Harry said. I won't come, she said, and there was nothing apologetic in it. I don't think I'm meant to be there for the actual working, but I want to tell you, she paused, and for a moment she had the quality she sometimes had of speaking from somewhere slightly outside ordinary time. It's going to feel very large. What you find down there, larger than this life's scope can comfortably hold. Don't try to hold it with your head, just let it move through you. Hermione looked at her. That's extraordinarily specific advice. I know things, Luna said simply. She folded her drawing and handed it to Harry. Keep this. And she reached into her satchel again and produced a small vial of clear liquid. This is a concentration of a substance I've been distilling for 3 weeks. I didn't know what for until this morning. Put 2 drops on your wand before you go down. It won't affect the magic, but it will affect your perception of the space. The old levels they exist at a frequency that modern sensory apparatus isn't calibrated for. This adjusts the calibration. Harry took the vial. It was warm. Luna, he said, how do you know any of this? She considered the question with genuine seriousness. My mother used to say that most people filter out most of reality because reality is too much to hold all at once, and the filter becomes the world they live in. I filter less than most people. She tilted her head. It's inconvenient sometimes, but it's useful for things like this. She picked up her satchel, nodded to both of them with the completeness of someone who has delivered everything they came to deliver, and walked away down the corridor toward the Great Hall, apparently intending to have breakfast. Harry and Hermione sat in the corridor with the drawing and the vial and the morning moving around them. Right, Harry said. Right, Hermione said. The day had a different texture than any other day of the term so far, not tense exactly but intentional, the way the last day before something significant always felt intentional, even when you were doing ordinary things. Harry went to lessons. He took notes in Transfiguration and performed well in Charms and ate lunch and talked to Ron about the Quidditch practice schedule with enough genuine attention that Ron noticed nothing unusual, but everything was slightly more present than usual. The quality of the light, the sound of the castle's working day, the voices, the footsteps, the bells, all of it vivid in the way things were vivid when you were aware you were inside a before, the before of something important. The before also contained Dumbledore, who Harry saw twice, once crossing the entrance hall in mid-morning with the unhurried purpose of a man who had somewhere to be and was taking the scenic route to think on the way, and once at the staff table during lunch with a quality of stillness that Harry now read accurately as Dumbledore not looking at something while thinking hard about it. He knew, or was very close to knowing, the full shape of it. Harry could feel the model completing in the headmaster's mind the way you could feel a thunderstorm approaching across open ground before you could see it. The question was whether Dumbledore would act before tonight or wait. Harry gave it 40% odds either way and spent the afternoon preparing for both. Hermione spent the afternoon in the archive. She came out at 5 with notes on the final technical detail they'd needed, the precise geometry of the disc's placement, described in the manual with an exactness that required no interpretation, and one additional piece of information from the 5th scroll that she shared with Harry quietly in the corridor outside the library. The working, she said, when it completes the sanctum aperture. I said before it would open the foundational architecture to any witch or wizard. But the 5th scroll is more specific than that. She paused. It doesn't just open access to the old techniques, it opens access to the full scope of individual magical capacity. Every witch and wizard currently operating below their actual ceiling, which is most of them because the ceiling is a function of restricted access, not inherent limitation. They'll feel it when it opens. Not immediately, not all at once, but the restriction lifts. The potential becomes available. Harry was quiet for a moment. What about people who built their identity on the ceiling existing? He said. People whose entire worldview depends on some people being inherently more capable than others. Their worldview becomes demonstrably false, she said. Empirically, undeniably, she held his gaze. A first-generation student who couldn't perform a Patronus before will be able to. A Muggle-born who was told their power had limits will discover the limits were artificial. Voldemort will still be Voldemort. The working doesn't diminish anyone, but it elevates everyone. He's built his project on diminishing, and when it's done there's no theoretical foundation left for blood supremacy at all. She paused. It's not a weapon, Harry, it's the opposite of a weapon, it's just truth made available. Harry thought about what Voldemort had built. Not just his armies, not just his Horcruxes, though those were problems still to be dealt with, and dealt with they would be, but that was a separate thread. He thought about the idea of Voldemort, about how much of the man's power was contingent on people believing that some lives mattered more than others and that magic was proof of it. About what happened to a supremacist project when the premise of supremacy was dismantled not by argument but by reality. He's going to come for this, Harry said. Yes, tonight or soon, Malfoy said within weeks, but if his detectors are showing the activation intensifying, he'll move faster, she finished. Which is why we need to be faster. She straightened the decisive posture. Tonight we go down, we complete the working before anyone has the chance to be complicated about it. Anyone including Dumbledore, Harry said. Anyone including Dumbledore. She said it without apology. He'll understand eventually, or he won't. But either way the working will be done, Harry nodded. After midnight, the map said the entrance to the lowest dungeon corridor is accessible from the 4th floor back staircase. We meet in the common room at midnight. She looked at him. And Harry, she stopped. The clinical precision was completely absent. Before tonight, the thing I said last night about addressing it tomorrow, today is tomorrow. The corridor was quiet around them. The afternoon sun was coming in at a long October angle through the window at the end of the hall, warming the stone floor in parallelograms, and Harry stood in the light feeling things settle into their correct positions. I know, he said. I don't want to have a significant conversation in a corridor, she said, but I wanted to before it gets complicated again. I wanted to say that what you said last night, in the archive, the 5 years. She looked at him directly, no evasion, no processing delay. That's true for me too, probably longer. I've been, a brief pause, considerably dishonest with myself about it for considerable time. Harry felt something open in his chest that had been closed for considerably longer than he'd acknowledged to himself. Same, he said. Good, she said with the crispness of someone filing a conclusion. Then softer, good. She went to the library. He stood in the corridor for a moment in the parallelogram of light, and the castle breathed, and he thought about 5 years and longer, and felt the rightness of it the way you felt the rightness of the sphere of light in an upturned palm. Not summoned. Arrived. The problem that Hermione had been managing for 3 days crystallized in the common room at 9:30 in the form of Ron. He came and sat beside Harry by the fire with the expression he wore when something was bothering him and he'd decided to bother someone else with it, which was the most honest thing about Ron and also occasionally exhausting. Something's going on, Ron said. Lots of things are always going on, Harry said. Don't do that, you've been doing that all week, answering with technically true statements that aren't actually answers. Ron leaned forward, elbows on knees. I'm your best mate. I've been your best mate for 6 years, I know when you're managing me. Harry looked at him. The fire was warm between them and Ron's expression was the genuine, uncomplicated version, no performance, no politics, just a person who cared and was asking directly. He owed Ron honesty. The question was the scope of it. I've been experiencing something I don't fully have words for yet, Harry said, which was true. It involves magical development that I'm still processing. Involves Hermione because she's experiencing it too. It's not dangerous. He paused, considered being more accurate. It's not dangerous to us. There's a risk in the broader picture that I'm working on managing. He looked at Ron steadily. When I have the full shape of it, I'll tell you everything, but right now, tonight, there's something I need to do that I need you to not ask about. Ron was quiet for a moment. Is Hermione safe? Yes. Are you safe? Yes. Is it going to fix things? With the war, that's the intention. Ron processed this with the speed of someone who had made a decision before asking the questions. All right, he said, you'll tell me when it's done. Everything, Harry said, I promise. Ron nodded, sat back, picked up a piece of parchment he'd brought from upstairs that was probably chess notation. I'm not sleeping tonight, he said conversationally. Just so you know, not waiting up, not watching, just not sleeping. Okay, Harry said with real warmth. Good. Ron unrolled the chess notation and frowned at it with total focus, as though the conversation had not happened, which was Ron at his best. Harry sat by the fire and waited for midnight. They went down at 10 past midnight, the invisibility cloak drawn close, the disc warm in Harry's hands. Hermione carried the translated notes. They put 2 drops of Luna's vial on each of their wands before leaving the common room, and Harry had noticed an immediate subtle shift in perception, a deepening of sensory register, the castle more present and more dimensional around him. as though a faint blur he hadn't known existed had resolved. The fourth-floor back staircase led to the lowest dungeon corridor by a route that wasn't on the standard maps, through a passage that Filch had apparently written off as a dead end in his years of cataloguing and never revisited. The passage ended in what looked like blank stone wall. Harry put his hand on it. He felt it as he'd felt the archive wall, the threshold quality, the old working underneath the surface, but different from the archive in degree. The archive had been hidden, this was sealed. There was intention in it, and the intention was not casual. He pressed his palm flat and brought his other hand up, and felt the geometry of the working in the stone the way you felt the architecture of a piece of music, not just intellectually but in the body, resonant. He said 3 words in the old language. The wall opened, not stepped aside, not dissolved. Opened like a door, with the decisive physicality of something that had been waiting for this specific instruction and had, while waiting, absolute confidence it would eventually come. Beyond it, descending stone carved into the bedrock, older than the castle above it, lit by nothing but present to the adjusted perception of the vial's substance as a space with its own ambient quality. The hum Luna had described was real and immediate here, not sound but physical, a frequency in the bone. They went down. The second level, Luna's cold part, was a horizontal passage carved in the bedrock with a ceiling high enough to stand in, running north to south under the castle. The walls were bare rock except for markings, not decorative, not symbolic in any casual sense, but working marks, the same script as the scrolls and books, covering the walls in dense parallel lines that Harry now could read, not fluently but enough. They were structural notations. A working manual inscribed in stone, the theory of the binding architecture written directly into the walls of the space that housed it, so that anyone present was surrounded by the working's own documentation. Hermione moved her wand light slowly along the walls, and Harry watched her face as she read. The expression was the same one she'd had reading the first scroll, recognition, not discovery. The specific quality of returning to something she'd written herself in a life she was still in the process of remembering. "It's all here," she said softly. "The full architecture, the installation notes, the maintenance instructions." She stopped at one section. "Read," turned to him. "Harry, the working has been running continuously." "What do you mean?" "Since it was installed. It's not dormant, it's running at a base level all this time. The reason Hogwarts wards are as strong as they are, the reason this castle has never fallen to any attack in its history, it's not the Founders' spellwork, it's this." She gestured at the walls, at the markings, at the fundamental level they were standing in. "The working has been sustaining and protecting this place for thousands of years. We built the best protection we could into our keystone site." She was quiet for a moment. "And Dumbledore, for all his intelligence, has spent his career maintaining wards that he thinks he built on top of bedrock, and the bedrock itself is a living working that has been doing more work than anything above it." Harry took that in. "And when we complete it, it doesn't change what's already here. It fulfills the working's stated purpose. It does what it was always designed to do, it just hasn't been able to do it yet because the completion was interrupted." He looked at the passage ahead of them. The entrance to the third level was visible now, not a wall but a threshold, a place where the air changed quality. No ward he could feel, not in the conventional sense, just the recognition response architecture reading him as he read it. He walked through, it didn't resist. Hermione crossed after him. The third level was different. The scale of it was the first thing, not a passage but a chamber, carved in dimensions that suggested a different relationship with space than practical architecture required. High and wide and extending beyond the range of their wand light on the north end, the walls here didn't have script. They had the working itself, the binding architecture rendered in 3 dimensions, the lines of it cut into the stone and running with a faint luminescence that the adjusted perception made visible. Every wall, the ceiling, the floor, the geometry covered everything, from ankle height to the top of the chamber, and the lines connected and cross-connected, and the whole space was inside the working. The working was the specific architectural interior of a structure that had been running on base power for thousands of years and knew, in whatever sense an ancient working could know, that its makers had come back. The warmth of the disc in Harry's hands spiked, not uncomfortably, recognizingly. "There," Hermione said. She was pointing at the floor. In the center of the chamber, where every line of the wall working converged, there was a circular depression in the stone, not carved by chisel, formed by geometry, the natural intersection point of the working's architecture. It was the precise size and shape of the disc. Harry walked to it. The disc was pulling toward it now, a gentle and absolute directional force, the way a magnet pulled toward iron. He crouched and held it over the depression. "Wait," Hermione said. He waited. She was standing at the edge of the working space, her wand light turned off, looking at the chamber with her eyes slightly unfocused, the look she used when she was reading the structure of something rather than its surface. He waited and watched her, and the chamber breathed around them with its ancient steady breath, and the disc in his hands was warm and patient. "The geometry is complete on all sides," she said finally. "There are no disruptions. No interference from above or outside." She looked at him. "The moment you place it, the working begins completion. It won't stop once it starts." I know, he said, and in approximately by dawn, he said, I know. She held his gaze across the chamber. In the geometric luminescence of the walls, she was all clean lines and dark eyes and the particular quality of someone who was entirely present, no drawer, no filing system, no deferral. Present in herself the way Seraphil had been present in the memories, fully occupying her own scope. We'll be visible, she said, the moment it starts. Every detector Voldemort has, every instrument Dumbledore is running, it'll be unmistakable. Yes, Harry said, and we won't be able to stop it once it begins. No, and we are choosing this. We are choosing this, Harry said with the flat, complete certainty of someone who has arrived at a decision through every available means and found it solid. She crossed the chamber and crouched beside him, the disc between his hands and the depression in the floor, the working waiting. Then the chamber shook, not violently, a single deep reverberation that came from above, from the castle's surface, and Harry and Hermione were on their feet before the sound of it had finished dying. That was a ward, Hermione said. Which one? Outer perimeter, south side. Her face was entirely focused. Something hit the outer ward with considerable force. Another reverberation, closer. Harry was already moving through the calculation. Voldemort's people, his detection instruments showing the activation intensifying, the location confirmed as Hogwarts. They wouldn't wait for their lord's arrival, not if they were close enough to act. They'd move to disrupt first, contain the phenomenon, and then report. And the disruption method for an ancient foundational working would be, they're trying to destabilize the upper wards, he said. If they can compromise the upper structure, they can't, Hermione said with cold certainty. The lower working sustains the upper wards. They'd have to penetrate to this level to genuinely disrupt anything. She looked at the disc, at the floor. Harry. If we wait, if we let the breach develop, then either Dumbledore's countermeasures engage and we have both sides above us simultaneously, or the Death Eaters breach far enough to disrupt the approach and we can't complete the working. The chamber shook again harder. Harry looked at the disc, looked at Hermione, looked at the depression in the floor. If we place it now, he said, the working is already running, completion in progress, nothing above can stop it. Nothing above can stop it, she confirmed. And whatever's happening at the surface needs to be handled, she said flatly. They looked at each other. Together, Harry said. Together, she agreed. He lowered the disc into the depression. It's seated with the simplicity of a thing finding its precise home, no ceremony, no drama, a clean mechanical completion, and then the working changed. The luminescence in the walls went from faint to full, instantaneous, every line of the geometry burning with steady gold-white light, the whole chamber suddenly and completely alive. The hum became audible, finally, not in the way of sound, but in the way of understanding, arriving fully where before it had been arriving fractionally. Harry felt it in his sternum, in his palms, in the specific place at the back of his skull, where he'd been feeling the return of the memories. And then something he hadn't expected. He felt Hermione, not literally, but in the working, the two-column architecture, the load-bearing relationship the scroll had described. He could feel her presence in the working the way you could feel the other tonal quality in a chord, distinct and separate, and making the whole thing coherent. She was there, present, her intelligence and her intent woven into the running architecture as naturally as his own. She made a small sound. I feel it too, she said. We should go, Harry said. They went up through the levels fast, the stone closing behind them as they moved, the working running steady in the foundations below. Through the second level, up the carved stairs, through the threshold, which sealed itself once they were through with a finality that meant it was now part of the running working, accessible only when the working decided, back into the lowest dungeon corridor. Up through the castle, moving quick and quiet under the cloak, and Harry was reading the battle situation through the castle walls the way he could now read the working in stone, the old perceptual sense receiving information. Outer perimeter, south and west sides, multiple attackers, coordinated, experienced, not random Death Eaters. This was a directed action. They emerged from the passage and into the dungeon corridor proper and found chaos. Or rather, found the containment of chaos. Hogwarts' internal defenses had activated, the castle's stone guardian systems that most students didn't know existed, passages sealing and redirecting, stone door frames thickening. Somewhere above them an alarm was running that wasn't a sound, more a vibration, the castle telling everyone inside it to be still and be careful. And at the far end of the corridor, 3 Death Eaters. They'd gotten inside through the breach, apparently finding an undefended lower entry point, and they were moving toward the lower levels with the directed certainty of people following an instrument reading. The foremost one, Rookwood, Harry identified him by build and the specific way he moved, had something in his hand that was glowing red-orange, a detector, pointing them toward the sub-foundation levels they'd just sealed. Rookwood saw them at the same moment Harry saw him. Potter, he said with a quality that was somewhere between satisfaction and disbelief. Then to the ones behind him, both of them. The Dark Lord wants them alive if possible, but he didn't finish the sentence because Harry disassembled the working of the detector in his hand, not a spell, not an incantation. He looked at the device and understood its architecture, cobbled dark magic detection principle overlaid with a framework that was barely coherent, and he found the seam in it and pulled, the way you'd find the loose thread in a knot and straighten it. and the detector came apart at its foundations, the magical component dissolving, the physical object dropping from Rookwood's hand as dead weight. 3 seconds, no wand, no sound. Rookwood stared at his empty hand. Petrificus, said one of the Death Eaters behind him. Hermione had already moved. She stepped to Harry's right and raised one hand, and the Petrificus caught a pressure wall that she'd placed between them and the Death Eaters with the same unhurried ease as the practice room, except this one was load-bearing in a different sense. It absorbed the spell completely, which conventional shield charms did, but also held the corridor, and the holding quality meant that the 2 Death Eaters behind Rookwood found themselves unable to advance. Not blocked, actively contained, the architecture of the working calculating their movement vectors and countering each one, which was not a thing conventional spellwork did. Rookwood wasn't bound by the pressure wall. He raised his wand. Harry looked at him. He didn't raise his wand. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Rookwood with the calm, complete attention of someone who has run the relevant calculation and found it very simple. And the magic that moved from him to Rookwood was the old kind, not an attack spell, not a curse, nothing designed to damage. It was a sealing working, the kind he'd read about in the manual, designed to interrupt a practitioner's access to their own magical channel. Temporary, effective immediately. Rookwood's wand produced a single feeble spark and then nothing. He tried again, nothing. He looked at Harry with the specific expression of a man whose entire framework of threat and capability has just been revised against his will. "I'd sit down," Harry said conversationally. The 2 behind the pressure wall were attempting more complex spells now, the kind that were designed to breach defensive structures. They were finding that the pressure wall adapted to each attempt with the fluidity of something alive, which it was, technically. It had the workings intelligence in it. "Hermione," Harry said. "I've got them," she said, and the pressure wall contracted fast and controlled until both Death Eaters were wrapped in architectural force that didn't hurt them but held them with the absolute certainty of a physical constraint, not unconscious, not damaged, simply thoroughly unable to do anything. She turned to look at Harry with the slightly breathless quality of someone who's just done something very large with an enormous amount of control. "That's significant improvement over the practice room," Harry said. "Live situation," she said. "Focus was different. Is the containment sustainable?" "For about 4 hours," she said. "By which point the working below should be far enough along that the relevant people can be notified and come collect them." She looked at Rookwood, sitting against the wall with the expression of someone revising their worldview in real time. "The castle's defenses are managing the outer breach. Dumbledore's activated the upper ward system." She paused. "He'll be down here in approximately 10 minutes. Then we have 10 minutes to be somewhere he can't have this conversation in an emergency context," Harry said. They went up through the castle quickly, leaving the sealed dungeon corridor behind, leaving 3 Death Eaters secured with architectural force that no one currently at Hogwarts had the theory base to dismantle. And as they went, Harry felt the working in the foundations running steady and deep and committed, the disc in its depression, the geometry fully alive, and the first degree of the opening already beginning in the way that dawn began, not yet visible. But the direction of time established beyond revision. Dumbledore arrived at the lower dungeon corridor 8 minutes later to find 3 Death Eaters secured in a working he had never seen and could not immediately analyze. A detector device dissolved to its component non-magical parts, and no students. He stood in the corridor for a long moment. He could feel the change in the foundations. Through 30 years of intimate familiarity with Hogwarts' magical architecture, he could feel that something in the deepest level was different, not wrong, not destabilized, but different, completed in a way it hadn't been completed before. Minerva arrived at his shoulder, took in the scene, looked at the secured Death Eaters, then at the dissolved detector, then at the working holding the containment, which she couldn't identify either, which was not an experience she had often. "Students?" she asked. "Harry and Miss Granger, I believe," Dumbledore said. She looked at him. "Albus, that containment working, I know. I've never seen anything like it. I've never even read anything like it." She paused. "It's not in any catalogue, not in any text I know." "I know," he said again. He was quiet for another moment, looking at the corridor, feeling the working in the foundations, thinking about the map on his desk, and the 2 names he'd written at the keystone position, and the conversation he'd had with Harry that had been exactly as honest as Harry had chosen to make it, and no more. He thought about the reading 3 hours ago of his detection instruments going from their ordinary background murmur to something that required no interpretation, an activation of massive scope, beginning in the sub-foundation levels, now running continuously and with an evident coherence that his instruments were having difficulty measuring because the working was more fundamental than the instrument's theoretical framework. He had been too slow, not in the sense of failure. Slowness had a different quality than failure, was less final and more instructive. He had been measuring this wrong. He had been thinking about Harry and Hermione as people experiencing something he needed to understand and manage and guide, and he had not fully adjusted for the possibility that they were already beyond the scope of management, that he was not the relevant authority here, that the authority here was several thousand years old and had made its own plans. He had been the greatest wizard of his age for so long that he had forgotten to ask what would happen when an age changed. "Minerva," he said, "I need to speak with Harry and Miss Granger. Not tonight, they've had a full night and there will be more before morning." He felt the working in the foundations shift by 1 degree the way the quality of darkness shifted in the last hour before dawn. "Tomorrow, when this has run its course." Minerva looked at him carefully. "You're not going to stop it?" "No," he said. "Could you?" she asked, not unkindly. He considered this with the honesty he reserved for Minerva and occasionally himself. "No," he said with a different quality than the first no. "I don't think I could." She looked at the containment working one more time. "Then I suggest we deal with the breach at the south wall," she said, "and let whatever is happening in the foundations happen." "Yes," Dumbledore said, "I think that's exactly right." They moved toward the outer breach, and behind them the corridor held its 3 prisoners in a working that was old enough to predate the concept of Hogwarts, and in the deepest level of the castle the disc sat in its depression and the geometry ran on every wall, and the working ran steady and true and patient, and the night moved toward its last hours. Harry and Hermione were in the room of requirement, not practicing. Sitting on the floor of the simple stone space that the room had produced when asked for somewhere to wait, leaning against the same wall, close enough that their shoulders were touching, which neither of them had arranged deliberately and neither was going to move away from. The working was in them both, they could feel it, the column quality, the load-bearing resonance of two things that were meant to support the same structure. It was quiet and warm and entirely present, the way the disc's warmth had been, not dramatic. "Just real. The Death Eaters found us quickly," Hermione said. "They have better detection than I accounted for." "It won't matter by morning," Harry said. "No," she agreed. "Voldemort is going to react to this," Harry said. "Not to tonight specifically, to the completed working. When it opens fully, he'll feel it. Everyone will in some sense, but he'll feel it as the thing it is, the dismantling of his foundational premise." "Yes, and he'll come." "He was coming anyway," she said. "The Horcruxes are still a problem. He's still a problem in the conventional sense. He has to be dealt with, and the working doesn't do that for us." She paused. "It makes the war's moral logic clearer. It doesn't end the war by itself." "No," Harry said. "We still have to end the war." "We will," she said, simply without bravado, in the tone of a statement of fact. He looked at her in the room's warm light and thought about 5 years and longer, about the drawer that had been too full for too long, about the moment in the archive when she'd been reading in the dark with everything else stripped away and what was left was what had always been there. "Hermione," he said. She looked at him. "When this is over," he said, "the working, the war, all of it, I don't know what the right word is, continue, keep going, the two of us." He said it simply, without performance, which was the only way he knew to say true things. Not because of the resonance, not because of the architecture, because of 5 years in the library at midnight and the way you argue and the fact that you knew about Dumbledore's pensive before it happened, and because I've been, he stopped briefly, considerably dishonest with myself about it for a considerably long time too. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the quality of someone who has finished building a model and found that it holds. "Yes," she said. "Not I'll think about it or when this is done or any of the other deferrals that the crowded drawer would have produced 6 months ago. Just yes, clean and present, the word she used when something was certain." Outside, the castle was managing the remnants of a breach in its outer wards with the particular efficiency of ancient magical architecture operating well below its actual ceiling. In the foundations below, the working ran its full geometric course, patient and complete and alive with the light of a thing fulfilling its designed purpose. And somewhere in the pre-dawn dark of the Midlands, Tom Riddle sat upright in his chair with an expression that his followers had never seen on his face before. Not rage, not the cold fury that passed for his ordinary emotional register. Something that was adjacent to fear, though he would have burned anyone alive who suggested it. He could feel it. Even from here, not the working specifically, not the architecture of it, but the consequence. A change in the quality of the magical world, beginning in Scotland and radiating outward, small now, barely perceptible, but with the directionality of something that would not stop. A door opening that could not be closed. A light coming on in a room that had been deliberately dark. He looked at Wormtail, who was cringing in the corner, and at Bellatrix, who was watching him with avid, nervous attention. "Hogwarts," he said. "My lord," Bellatrix said. "We go to Hogwarts," he said. His voice was flat and final and entirely without the quality it normally had, the theatrical command, the practiced authority. This was something more direct, more personal, the voice of a man who has just understood that something he counted on not existing exists. "When my lord." "Now," he said. "We go now." The fire crackled in the dark room. Outside, the sky was beginning its last-hour shift, the faintest promise of east-facing light still well below the horizon but committed to the direction of arriving. The working ran on. Chapter 6. The weight of ancient names. Dawn came slowly to Hogwarts. The way it always did in October, not a clean arrival but a gradual negotiation between dark and light, the eastern sky going through stages of grey that each looked like the last until suddenly they weren't, until the distinction between sky and hill became visible and the lake materialized from darkness into a surface that remembered how to hold light. Harry watched it from the window of the room of requirement. Slept for 2 hours against the wall, Hermione's shoulder under his cheek, which was a thing that had happened without arrangement and which he wasn't going to retroactively make complicated. She was awake now too, standing at the other window, her notes spread on the floor behind her, untouched for the past hour. They could both feel the working below them. It had changed over the course of the night, not in its fundamental quality but in its scope, the way a river changed as it approached the sea. Deeper. More present, carrying more. Harry had felt it in stages as he'd moved between sleep and waking, each stage a degree more of the opening sensation, the sanctum aperture the scroll had described, the foundational architecture making itself available in the way that a frequency made itself available when the right instrument was tuned to receive it. He thought about all the people asleep in this castle right now who were going to wake up different in ways they wouldn't be able to name immediately. Not dramatically different, not transformed, just more accurately themselves, more fully in possession of what they'd always had. "It's close," Hermione said. "Yes," Harry said. 20 minutes, maybe less." She turned from the window. Her face in the pre-dawn light had the quality it had in the archive, all surface performances dissolved. What was left was just her, precise and warm and fully present. She twisted her hair back at some point in the night and there were ink marks on her left hand from the notes she'd been making. "He's coming," she said. "I know. Luna's vial is worn off. Can you still feel the lower level?" Harry put his palm to the floor. The working came up through the stone with its geometric warmth, steady and running. "Yes, it's not the vial, it's the resonance." He looked up at her. "We don't need the vial anymore." She understood what he meant. Not just for the lower level perception. The calibration adjustment Luna's substance had provided had been an external aid for underdeveloped reception. The reception had since developed. The working had, in completing itself, completed something in them too. "The Horcruxes," Hermione said. "We discussed this. The working doesn't address them. He's still anchored." "I know, but..." Harry paused, feeling along the edge of something he'd been working out since the previous night. "The working doesn't address them directly, but think about what the Horcruxes are, what they're built on. They're a form of magical architecture, the darkest, most foundational kind, the kind that requires a fundamental violation of the magical structure to create." He met her eyes. "If the foundational architecture is now fully open, if the full depth of it is running and available, the Horcruxes are built on a corrupted version of the same base," she said, and her voice went sharp with the speed of comprehension. "The architectural opening doesn't just open access for people, it corrects the distortions in the foundational working that make dark magic of that magnitude possible." She was already working through it. He could see the equations moving behind her eyes. "It doesn't destroy the Horcruxes from outside. It makes the architecture they're embedded in, it makes it correct, and the Horcruxes are the wrong shape for correct architecture. They become structurally untenable," Harry said. "As the aperture completes," she said. "By dawn." They looked at each other. "He knows that," Harry said. "That's why he's moving now. He can feel it happening and he knows what it means for the pieces of his soul he's scattered." "He's not coming for the working," Hermione said. "He can't stop it. He's coming because he has nothing left to lose." The room was quiet. The pre-dawn light was doing its slow work outside, and somewhere below the castle the geometry ran its final degrees, and in the Midlands Tom Riddle and his inner circle were moving through the dark towards Scotland with the specific quality of motion that belonged to someone whose strategic position had collapsed and who had defaulted to the only thing left that felt like power. "We should go outside," Harry said. "Yes." She picked up her notes from the floor, folded them once and put them in her bag, not because she needed them but because the habit of keeping research close was bone deep. "The grounds, wide space, we don't want this in the castle with students." "Agreed." He was already at the door. "Hermione, the workings, what we practiced, what we can do." He paused. "Today and whatever's coming, I don't want any of it kept back. I mean that." She met his eyes. "Neither do I," she said simply. They left the room of requirement, and the door dissolved into wall behind them, and they walked through the corridor that was beginning to catch the first grey light from high windows, and the castle was waking up around them, not yet in the human sense, students still sleeping, but in the older sense, the foundational sense, the working below reaching its last stage and the building above it responding. Dumbledore was on the front steps, not waiting or not only waiting. He was looking out over the grounds with the quality of a man who has made a decision and is standing in it. When Harry and Hermione came through the main doors he turned, and his face had a different quality than Harry had ever seen on it, not the managed warmth or the careful intelligence, something older, something that was, under all the decades of performance, genuinely tired and genuinely honest. "I thought you'd come this way," he said. "Professor," Harry said. "I owe you both an apology," Dumbledore said. He said it without preamble, without the elegant framing that normally cushioned his difficult statements, and the absence of framing made it more real, not less. "I've been managing you, both of you, for some time, and I've told myself it was care, and it was also care, but it was other things too, and you deserve to know that I know that." Harry looked at him. The pity he'd felt in the office 3 nights ago was still there, but it had a different shape now, less like looking down at something and more like standing beside it. "I know," Harry said. "I've known for a while." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I think you have." He looked at Hermione. "The working in the foundations, it's yours." "Ours," she said, "from a long time ago." "I found the geographical correspondence 3 weeks ago," he said. "It took me longer than it should have to understand what I was looking at. I've spent my career believing that the pre-founder period was a historical gap. It was not a gap, and the evidence was always there." He paused. I restricted those archive materials because they raised questions I hadn't answered. I told myself it was prudence. It was also easier not to have the questions being asked, Hermione said. Yes, he said it without evasion. Exactly that. He looked between them, and his blue eyes had the deep quality Harry had always known in them, except that tonight, in the pre-dawn grey, the depth looked different. Not the depth of a man who was the authority in the room, but the depth of a man who was genuinely present. I went to the lower dungeon corridor last night. I saw the containment working. I can't analyze it. I've been at this for over 100 years, and I have no framework for what you two produced in a corridor without wands in a live combat situation, apparently without particular effort. It was some effort, Hermione said honestly. Some, Harry confirmed. Will you tell me, Dumbledore said, what the working completes? What happens when it opens fully? Harry looked at him. Really looked with the full attention he'd been applying to people lately, the old perceptual sense that could read the architecture of a person the way it read the architecture of stone. He saw the genuine question in it, the genuine desire to understand, not to manage, not to redirect. A man who had decided, sometime in the last 24 hours, to stop being in charge of this situation and start being honestly curious about it. He told him. Concisely, accurately, the full description, the sanctum aperture, the opening of foundational access, the lifting of artificial ceilings, the structural untenableness of dark magic of the Horcrux type in fully correct architecture. He told him what the 30 had tried to prevent and why, and what Kalian and Seraphil had built, and what they'd encoded in the foundations and the bloodlines and the archive. He told him all of it, and Dumbledore listened without speaking, which was its own kind of extraordinary. When Harry finished, the sky had moved another degree toward light. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. The children in this school who have been struggling, he said finally, not to either of them specifically, the students who came from Muggle families and found themselves at a disadvantage that no amount of studying quite bridged. It bridges, Hermione said. When the aperture opens, it bridges. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were bright in a different way than usual. I should have, he began. You didn't know, Harry said, not generously, accurately. And it didn't matter that you didn't know because we came back. We were always going to come back. He paused. That's the thing about a plan that spans thousands of years. It doesn't require the people in it to be perfect. It just requires the architecture to be right. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You're nothing like what I expected you to be when you were 11 years old, he said, and his tone had in it both the obvious meaning and something larger, something that was an acknowledgement of the gap between what he'd shaped and what had grown regardless. I know, Harry said without unkindness. The dawn was genuinely coming now. The eastern hills had a clear edge against a sky that was going from grey toward the first serious commitment to light. The grounds below the front steps were visible, the dark shapes of trees, the movement of the lake's surface, the long lawn going white with frost, and at the edge of the wards a disturbance. Harry felt it before he saw it. The outer perimeter that Dumbledore's people had been repairing through the night was intact but registering multiple presences, organized, moving with the unified intent of people who had decided on an approach. Harry counted instinctively the way he'd been counting things since the old perceptual sense had sharpened. 32 people, plus one that registered differently, one that registered as a cold spot in the working's warmth, a disruption in the foundational frequency, a thing that had spent decades making itself structurally wrong and felt that wrongness as presence. He's here, Harry said. Dumbledore turned. Hermione was already moving down the front steps, pulling her robes straight with the absent adjustment of someone settling into what came next. How many? Dumbledore said. 32 Death Eaters, Harry said, plus Voldemort. He was down the steps and onto the frost-stiff grass, and it crunched under his feet, and the cold was sharp and present and entirely fine. I'd recommend waking the staff, not students. The staff can defend the building if any of them breach the perimeter. But this ends on the grounds, in the open. Dumbledore looked at him. You know this? Yes, then I'll trust that, Dumbledore said simply, and it cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway and went back inside. Harry and Hermione stood on the frost-white lawn in the pre-dawn grey, the castle at their backs, the ground stretching out before them to the edge of the wards where 32 people plus one were making their approach. How do you want to do this? Hermione asked. I'd like not to kill anyone who doesn't require it, Harry said. Agreed. The Death Eaters we contain, the same working as last night but larger scale. If we can't contain all of them, we prioritize the most dangerous. He paused. Bellatrix. Obviously, Hermione said in the tone she used for things that went without saying. And Voldemort, he stopped. Felt for the working in the foundations, the running geometry, the aperture at its last stage. He felt the Horcrux quality he'd identified, the wrong-shaped things embedded in the architecture of the world, uncomfortable in the correcting field of the opening. He can feel the Horcruxes destabilizing, Harry said. That's why he came now. He doesn't have a plan, he has desperation. Desperate Voldemort is more dangerous than strategic Voldemort, Hermione said. Yes, and also, Harry paused, less stable. The architectural correction doesn't just affect his Horcruxes. It affects him, the magic he's built himself on, the dark foundational workings that allow what he's become to exist. As the aperture opens, he's going to feel each degree of it as a degradation. He met her eyes. He's already feeling it. That's the cold I'm reading. That's not his natural magical signature. That's the signature of something being undone. She understood this immediately. We don't have to fight him the way we'd fight him last month, she said. We just have to survive long enough and keep him from taking anything with him when he goes, Harry said. The ward edge was breached. They came through in formation, the Death Eaters spilling onto the grounds with the organized aggression of people who'd been told the resistance would be 2 sixth-year students and had adjusted their threat assessment accordingly. Masks up, wands out, covering the ground in a practice spread that was designed to prevent retreat. Harry watched them come. He was standing still with his hands at his sides and his wand in its holster, and the frost crackled under each footfall of 32 people, and he breathed out a slow breath that misted in the cold air. Then Voldemort came through the ward edge, and the temperature dropped by 2 degrees in a radius. He looked the way he always looked, the chalk-white face, the flat red eyes, the robes that were just slightly wrong in the way that a person who had deliberately unmade their humanity was slightly wrong. But there was something new this morning, a quality of physical tightness, a barely perceptible strain as though he were holding something together that was trying to come apart. His eyes moved immediately to Harry with the specific quality of a man who had been thinking about this particular obstacle for 15 years and had not in all that time managed to stop being surprised by what he found when he looked at it. Potter, he said. Voldemort, Harry said. The using of the name still registered. Harry watched the microshift in his expression, the involuntary reaction to being named without flinching. 15 years of cultivating the world's fear of his name, and here was a 16-year-old who said it like weather. You've done something to the foundations of this castle, Voldemort said, not a question. Something that's affecting, something that requires my attention before it proceeds further. It's already proceeded as far as it needs to, Harry said. You're about 10 minutes too late to affect the outcome. Voldemort looked at him, and the red eyes were doing their assessment thing, rapid and cold, and Harry let them. He was genuinely uninterested in performing threat for Voldemort's benefit. He stood on the frostwhite lawn and was entirely present and waited for what came next. Kill them, Voldemort said. It was abrupt. That was unusual. Voldemort normally had more theatre in him for the opening of a significant confrontation. The abruptness confirmed what Harry had read. He was not fully himself this morning. The degrading working beneath him was affecting his performance, his composure, the theatrical authority that was as much a weapon as his wand. 32 Death Eaters moved. Harry and Hermione moved first. What happened over the next 4 minutes was not a battle in the conventional sense. Battles had a chaotic quality, a reciprocal attack and defense, constant adjustment, the grinding attrition of 2 forces testing each other's limits. What happened on the Hogwarts grounds in the pre-dawn October cold was something more like a demonstration. Hermione raised both hands and the pressure architecture went wide, not a wall this time, but a field, spanning 40 feet of ground to either side in an expanding arc that caught the first wave of attacking spells and didn't just deflect them but absorbed their magical content and redirected it, feeding it back into the working as coherent energy. The Death Eaters in the first line hit the field and found themselves inside the architecture, contained with the same certainty as the dungeon corridor, but at scale, their movements catalogued and counted with a speed that no individual spellcaster could match because the architecture was not an individual spellcaster, it was a system. The ones who'd broken wide on the flanks, trying to go around the field, the sensible tactical choice found Harry. He didn't use his wand. He'd made this choice before they came through the ward edge, standing on the frostwhite lawn, feeling the working in the foundations and understanding clearly that his wand was a reflex, a habit, a tool he'd trained with since he was 11, and it was a good tool and it had served him well, and today it was the wrong one. He moved through the left flank with his hands open and his attention fully extended, the old perceptual sense running hot, reading each person's intent a half-second before their action. He sealed 2 Death Eaters' magical channels the way he'd sealed Rookwood's the night before, the temporary interrupt, clean and immediate. 2 more he caught in pressure constraints that held them mid-stride. Dolohov, who was fast and experienced and knew which angles to attack from, got through far enough to fire a slashing curse that Harry let land on a reflected architecture. The working absorbed it and gave it back to the empty air 6 feet to Dolohov's right, and Dolohov had a moment of genuine confusion before the constraint caught him. Bellatrix broke left and went for Hermione. Which was, Harry thought in the half-second he had to think about it, the most significant strategic error of her life. Hermione turned to face her without hurry. Bellatrix was magnificent in the specific way that entirely unhinged dedication to a cause was magnificent, fast and creative and absolutely without fear, her spells coming in combinations that were legitimately impressive, layered and overlapping, designed for someone who had to work hard to deflect them. Hermione deflected the first combination with one hand, building a counter-architecture on the fly that didn't just block but responded. Each block became a structural element of a larger working that was doing 3 things simultaneously. She looked like she was doing very little. She looked, in fact, like she was thinking about something else, which was because she was thinking about the working below, tracking its final degrees of completion, and managing Bellatrix as a secondary task. Bellatrix apparently found this insulting. "Fight me properly," she snarled, sending a curse that was designed to get through reflective shields by randomizing its frequency. I am, Hermione said, and the working she'd been building on the fly completed, and Bellatrix hit a full architectural constraint from 3 sides simultaneously and stopped moving mid-stride, with an expression of absolute furious disbelief frozen on her face. Hermione looked at the frozen expression for a moment. I've actually been waiting to do that since 4th year, she said with a precision that made it not quite gloating. The flanks were contained. The main mass was contained in the field. Harry turned to Voldemort, who had not moved from his position at the edge of the grounds and was watching with the specific quality of a general watching the tactical destruction of his forces, not retreating, not surrendering, performing control of a situation over which he had lost control. The red eyes were different. They'd been different since he came through the ward edge, but now more so. There was a quality in them that Harry recognized as pain, though Voldemort would have described it otherwise. The Horcruxes, the working below reaching its last degree, the architecture correcting around the wrong-shaped things embedded in it. Harry could feel the wrongness destabilizing the way you could feel a bad note resolving toward true pitch, not instant, not comfortable, but inevitable. Voldemort raised his wand. Avada Kedavra, he said, not with the performance he usually brought to it. Flat, functional, the last tool remaining to a man who had run out of other tools. Harry raised his hand and the death curse hit a working that he'd had in place since the moment Voldemort came through the ward edge, a deep geometric shield that he'd been running at the base level, below conscious attention, the way you ran breathing, not a reflective architecture. Something more specific, a working that accepted the death curse and performed on it the same analysis he'd performed on Rookwood's detector, found the seam, pulled the thread. The killing curse denied the architectural coherence that made it function, broke apart on the working into its component magical elements, which were individually harmless and dissipated on the cold October air. Voldemort looked at this. He tried again. Different angle, different casting approach, the variation of a man who was not stupid and was looking for the gap in the defense. The working found the seam in this one faster, already calibrated. What is this? Voldemort said, and it was the most unguarded thing Harry had ever heard from him, not theatrical rage, not cold command, but genuine incomprehension. The question of a man whose map of the world has stopped corresponding to the territory. Old magic, Harry said. Older than anything you've built yourself from. Voldemort looked at him with the red eyes that were doing less hiding than usual. You're a child, he said. I'm a child right now, Harry said. In the relevant sense, I'm considerably older than you. He moved toward Voldemort, not running, not performing threat, walking with the deliberate, unhurried quality that Caelian had used in the memories, the pace of someone whose relationship with time was different from the people around them. Voldemort fired 3 spells in the approach, 2 dark curses and one of his inventions, the snakefang curse that he used on people he was angry at, and Harry walked through all 3 without wand, without incantation, the workings dismantling each one at their seams with the steady precision of someone performing a familiar task. He stopped 10 feet from Voldemort. Feel them going, Harry said quietly. He wasn't speaking for anyone else. It was just the 2 of them in this particular bubble of the fight, the rest of the grounds held in the field and the constraints. Your Horcruxes, the working's been running all night. Each one becomes structurally wrong in fully correct architecture, and the correct architecture is everywhere now and, be quiet, Voldemort said. You feel them, Harry said, not a question. And he did. It was in his face, in the controlled mask of it cracking slightly at the edges, in the quality of the red eyes that were, this morning, doing less of the cold theatricality and more of the thing underneath it, which was the very old fear of a man who had spent 40 years making himself unkillable and was discovering that the mechanisms of his unkillability were built on a foundation that no longer held their weight. The Horcruxes are already gone, Harry said, still quietly. Or going. The architecture corrects itself as the aperture opens. You can try to fight that, but you'd be fighting the mathematical coherence of a working that has been running for several thousand years, and has the full geometric logic of the foundational architecture behind it. He paused. You built your immortality on a corrupted version of the deepest magic there is, and the deepest magic is correcting itself. Voldemort stared at him. You have no power over me, he said with the tone of a man saying it because the alternative to saying it was acknowledging the reverse. I don't need power over you, Harry said. I just need to stand here. The sun chose this moment to clear the eastern hills. It was exactly dawn, not the pre-dawn grey but the actual first light, the direct line between the sun and the October ground, the moment when shadows snapped into existence and the frost on the grass went suddenly gold. The light came across the grounds and caught everything, the frost, the mist off the lake, the contained Death Eaters in their field, Hermione standing with her arms at her sides looking at Voldemort with an expression that had in it the particular calm of someone watching an inevitable structural failure they've already calculated, the working completed. Harry felt it through the soles of his feet, up through the stone and the frost and the thin layer of October air between him and the ground. Not a sound. Not a visible effect. A change in the quality of the morning, in the relationship between the magical world and the people standing in it. Something opening simply and completely, the way a window opened, the previous condition was closed, and now the condition was open and the air moved through where before it hadn't. Voldemort made a sound. It was brief and involuntary, and he stopped it immediately, which meant Harry and Hermione both heard it, and he knew they both heard it, which was its own kind of ending. The last of the Horcruxes came apart in the correcting architecture. Harry felt it not individually, not each one as a separate event, but as a collective structural failure, the wrong-shaped things losing coherence simultaneously as the foundational working reached full operation, and the field they were embedded in became incompatible with their existence. Not destroyed, unmade, the way a knot was unmade when the tension it depended on was released. Tom Riddle was mortal. He had been mortal at various points in Harry's life before, in the graveyard on the basis of the priori incantatem connection, at the Ministry briefly, in the moments of near death that Harry had survived, each one leaving Voldemort slightly less of the thing he'd been trying to be. But this was different. This was final in the way that structural changes were final. There was no rebuilding this. The architecture was correct now, and the correct architecture didn't have a place in it for Tom Riddle to hide pieces of his soul. He looked at Harry with the red eyes, and Harry looked back. "It's over," Harry said. "You haven't won anything," Voldemort said, and even now the voice was controlled, the tone of a man who would not be seen to break. "I haven't tried to win anything," Harry said. "That's your framework. I was just trying to finish something." Voldemort looked at the grounds, the contained Death Eaters, the dawn light, Hermione standing calm and present, the castle behind her coming alive with the sounds of staff descending toward the grounds. He looked at Harry with an expression that was, under everything else, a very ordinary human despair, the despair of a man who spent his entire life running from death and had run himself into a corner. "Do it then," he said. "No," Harry said, a pause. "What?" "I'm not going to kill you," Harry said. "I'm going to give Dumbledore the opportunity to take you into custody and let the Wisengamot determine what happens next, which is the appropriate process." He paused. "I know that's not how you expected this to end." Voldemort looked at him for a long moment. The red eyes were searching for the trick in it, the manipulation, the angle. There wasn't one. "You're not afraid of me," Voldemort said, and it was not accusatory, not theatrical. It was genuinely baffled, the observation of a man whose entire operating model of the world was built on fear as the primary currency, confronting someone who simply wasn't spending it. "No," Harry said. Voldemort looked at the working in the grounds around him, the field holding his Death Eaters, the constraints, the dawn light on the frost, and something in his face did the thing that happens when a very old structure finally settles into the shape it's been becoming for a long time. Not dramatic. Not a visible collapse, just settling. He lowered his wand. It was probably the most extraordinary thing Harry had ever witnessed Voldemort do, including every act of magic he'd ever seen the man perform. Dumbledore came across the grounds with McGonagall and 4 other staff members, moving at a pace that was quick and serious and also slightly cautious, because Dumbledore had been watching from the castle doors and had seen enough of the preceding 20 minutes to know that the dynamic on this particular field was not one that required his intervention in any urgent sense. He reached Harry and Voldemort and looked between them. "Tom," he said. Voldemort looked at him with the red eyes and the collapsed mask and said nothing. "It's over," Dumbledore said gently, and with genuine sadness that was not performed, the sadness of a man who had known the boy this person had once been and had failed to help him in ways that mattered. "It has been over for some time. Let it be over now." McGonagall and the others moved forward with the specific purpose of people who knew what was needed, and Voldemort, Tom Riddle, who had been afraid of death for his entire life and had made the world afraid alongside him, who had murdered and broken and built an empire of terror out of the raw material of human fear, who had split his soul into pieces and distributed the pieces across the world and killed a child's parents and made the same child live in a cupboard under stairs for a decade, who had built himself into the most feared dark wizard in a century and had then met something older and more patient than fear. Tom Riddle allowed himself to be taken. Harry watched him go and felt nothing dramatic, a kind of stillness, the specific quiet of a thing that has been finished rather than abandoned. The grounds were very busy after that. The contained Death Eaters, once it was clear that what was holding them was not going to be broken by conventional means, were collected by the staff with the methodical efficiency of people who had been trained for precisely this situation, and were grateful it had presented in a somewhat more contained form than expected. Hermione released the field and the constraints one at a time, with a precision that earned a look from Minerva McGonagall, the sharp-eyed, slightly stunned look that Harry had seen her give things that didn't fit her existing categories. She didn't say anything about it until after the last Death Eater was secured, and the outer wards had been resealed by 3 senior members of the Order who'd arrived from London in 35 minutes, which was fast enough to suggest they'd been on alert. Then McGonagall stood next to Harry on the frost-flattened lawn as the sun rose fully over the hills and said, without looking at him, "The containment working you used last night in the lower corridor, and again here. I've been doing magic for 60 years, Mr. Potter. I want you to know that I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you, Professor," Harry said. She was quiet for a moment. "Is it something you can teach?" He considered this honestly. "Some of it," he said. "The theoretical basis is in the archive. Hermione's been translating it." He paused. With the aperture open, I think most witches and wizards will be able to learn the foundational principles. It won't be automatic, it's still a skill, but the access is there now. McGonagall looked at the horizon. The aperture, she said. I assume that accounts for what I felt approximately 17 minutes ago. What did it feel like? She was quiet for a long moment. Like something becoming possible that I'd been told wasn't, she said. Something quite large. Yes, Harry said. That's it exactly. She gave him one more look, not the teach-assessing student look, something more level, and went to assist with the organization of prisoner transport. Hermione appeared at his shoulder. She was carrying her bag and her hair was still twisted back, and there was a second ink mark on her hand that he didn't think had been there before. She looked at the grounds, the activity, the morning light, the castle behind them with students now visible at windows, drawn by the sounds and the unusual number of adults moving with purpose on the lawn below. Ron is going to have a great deal of questions, she said. He is, Harry agreed. Luna will have already told him something that's approximately correct but structurally eccentric, she said. Probably. He looked at her. Are you all right? She considered the question properly, which was one of the things he appreciated about her. She didn't reflex answer it. Yes, she said. I'm very tired and my left shoulder's complaining about something I did with the field architecture, and I think I need about 12 hours of sleep in the near future. A pause. But yes, all right. The aperture, Harry said. Can you feel it from here? She put her hand against the stone of the front steps. Her eyes went briefly distant, reading. Yes, she said. It's fully open. The working is running at, she paused, finding the right word, completion. Everything's running. The morning was clear and cold, and the frost was beginning to melt where the sun caught the grass, and the lake held the sky in its dark surface, and over everything the working ran its deep steady note, the geometry of a foundational architecture fulfilling its purpose, the sanctum aperture doing exactly what it had been designed to do 3,000 years ago by two people who had apparently trusted the future enough to build it something to stand on. Harry stood next to Hermione on the front steps of Hogwarts and thought about all of it, the weight of it, the 1,000-year plan and the cupboard under the stairs and the archive and the disc, and the cold stone of the sub-foundations and the frostwhite lawn and Tom Riddle lowering his wand in the early light. He thought about Calian and Seraphil, and about the strange, specific comfort of discovering that the oldest part of yourself was not the burdened part, that the part with the longest memory was also the most certain of its own ground. He thought about the people waking up in the castle above him who would feel today or tomorrow or sometime soon a door open that they hadn't known was closed, the first-generation students, the witches and wizards who'd been told their ceilings were their ceilings. The magical world, enormous and complicated, and full of people who deserved more than what they'd been given access to. He thought about Hermione at 17, standing on a frostwhite lawn at dawn after the longest night of either of their lives, with ink on her hand and her research bag over her shoulder, having just single-handedly contained 20-plus Death Eaters with old magic she'd been remembering for 3 weeks, and still, underneath all of it, being fundamentally and irreducibly herself. The person who'd pulled him through 6 years of impossible things, not because she was playing a role in his story, but because she'd made her own choices, and those choices had led here to this morning, to this opening. He thought, of course. Ron is definitely going to have questions, Harry said. Enormous ones, she agreed. We should have answers ready. We'll never have enough answers ready. Ron generates questions faster than answers can satisfy them. She looked at him sideways. Are you stalling? A little, he said honestly. What are you stalling from? He turned to face her fully, on the front steps of Hogwarts in the October morning with the castle at their backs and the whole changed world in front of them, and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the archive, the way that stopped pretending it was something else. I wanted to say something, he said. Before the 12 hours of sleep and Ron's questions and Dumbledore's formal conversations, and whatever the Ministry decides to do about all of this, which is going to be exhausting. He paused. I wanted to say this, what we did, what we remembered, what we built. I'm not treating it as something that happened to us, I'm treating it as something we chose. She looked at him with that expression, the unguarded, certain one. We did choose it, she said, both lives, the old one and this one. She put her hand on his arm, simply and without ceremony, the gesture of someone who has already made all the relevant decisions and finds the execution easy by comparison. And we'll choose what comes next too. The morning held them on the steps. Behind them, Hogwarts breathed with the deep working note of a building whose foundations had completed what they'd always been running toward. Around them, the grounds were coming alive with the ordinary business of aftermath, voices, movement, the specific organized chaos of an institution re-establishing normal operations after an extraordinary event. Below them, in the deepest level of the castle, the disc sat in its depression in the center of the chamber where every geometric line converged, warm and patient and finally completely at rest. 3,000 years, not a bad wait, given what had been waiting at the end of it. Harry put his hand over Hermione's on his arm, not dramatic, not a conclusion, a beginning which was its own kind of exactly right. The sun cleared the hills entirely, the frost melted, the aperture ran.